Falling Slowly, a Pride and Prejudice novella, written by Christy Capps, narrated by Stevie Zimmerman. Chapter 1. Where on earth was Miss Elizabeth Bennet? Fitzwilliam Darcy hurried down Netherfield Park's corridors, glancing into each of the rooms, before rushing to the next. Where was she? Guilt ate at him. For as long as he lived, Darcy would never forget Miss Elizabeth Bennet's stunned expression when she stepped into the drawing-room of Netherfield Park. Caroline Bingley, whose irritation was barely masked, denounced the Bennet family's complete lack of manners. In particular, she attacked Miss Elizabeth. "I must confess that I never could see any beauty in her. Her face is too thin, her complexion is dull, her features are not at all handsome, her nose wants character. There is nothing marked in its lines. Her teeth are tolerable, but not out of the common way. As for her eyes, which have sometimes been called fine, I never could perceive anything extraordinary in them. They have a sharp, shrewish look, which I do not like at all. I'm sure you agree, Mr. Darcy, that in her attitude is a self-sufficiency and impertinence which is intolerable." Unfortunately, during her tirade, Darcy sat in silence, doing and saying nothing to stop his hostess from committing the egregious error of speaking scathingly against a guest. Miss Bingley was clearly in the wrong. So was he. A gentleman would never allow harm to come to a lady. The least he should have done was defend Miss Elizabeth, or he should have removed himself from the conversation. He did neither. Therefore he needed to do whatever was in his power to make it right with Miss Elizabeth. Catching the notice of Bingley's ageing butler in the hall, Darcy asked, "Did Miss Elizabeth leave the house?" "Aye, sir. About 15 minutes ago, she requested her coat and bonnet. I believe she intended to take a brisk walk around the lake." With a quarter-hour lead, Darcy worried he would not be able to catch her if he waited for his horse. Instead of heading to the stable, he accepted his outerwear and then took off down the footpath. Once he could no longer be seen from the windows of the great house, he ran. Surely Miss Elizabeth must be halfway around the lake, where ancient oaks line the narrow path. Occasionally, as the shrubbery opened, he could see across the water to the other side of the lake. He kept vigilant, hoping to spot her progress. Moving ever faster, he stopped at the next clearing, and was overjoyed to catch a glimpse of Miss Elizabeth through the trees. He called out. She turned his way without breaking her stride. He was horrified to see her feet slip. After frantically trying to keep her balance, she landed on her back with a thud. Then she did not move at all. Oh, good Lord! Had he startled her? "Miss Elizabeth!" he yelled. She lay still, as panic rose in his body. He whispered her name as he ran, chanting it with every step. He rounded a bend, and found her as he had seen her, motionless, only a tendril of hair that had escaped her bonnet moving in the slight breeze. Impervious to his surroundings, he dropped to his knees beside her, gulping air as he surveyed her head to her toes. Picking up her gloved hand and holding it between both of his, he watched to see if her chest moved up and down. To his vast relief, it did. "Miss Elizabeth, I beg you, open your eyes." He reached under her bonnet and found a stone, almost the size of his fist. His heart sank to the pit of his stomach. He knew of the dangers of moving someone with a head injury. "Please, Elizabeth, wake up, please." His earnest requests went unheeded. Gingerly, he tucked his scarf under her head. He ripped off his cravat, took the 2 steps to the shore, and dipped it into the lake. Returning to her side, he wiped the mud from her cheek. He should have run faster. He would have reached her sooner. "Miss Elizabeth, you must wake up. We must leave here." Darcy glanced across the lake, in hopes they would be seen from the house. Since the only thing visible from their location was the chimneys, the likelihood of anyone seeing them was nil. Until nightfall, there would be no reason for the household to worry about his absence, and he could not fathom his hostess, Miss Bingley, being concerned about Miss Elizabeth's whereabouts at all. The cool water failed to revive her, and even though her breathing seemed regular, his worry escalated. He could not leave her to run for help. The sun had already started its descent. By the time he returned to Netherfield Park and back, it would be dark enough that he would not be able to detect any obstacles in the path. The chill in the air grew colder as the minutes passed. Darcy heard her breathing change, before her head slightly moved from side to side. She groaned softly. Her eyes remained closed. "Miss Elizabeth," he said. Her movements stilled, and her breathing returned to the same rhythm it had before she stirred. He would do what he could to protect her. Removing his greatcoat, he covered her. Tucking the sides underneath her, Darcy slid his hands beneath her, lifting her into his arms. The return to Netherfield Park would be arduous. He was grateful she remained unconscious, if it protected her from further pain. At the same time, he recalled the doctor's orders when his cousin sustained a head injury. They were not to allow Richard to fall asleep. Should he do the same for her? Although his inclination was to hurry, he forced himself to move slowly. Blast and damnation! Fearful for her welfare, he could not help speaking of the first thing that came to mind, wishing for any reaction, even ire. "I need to tell you how mortified I am that you heard my harsh words at the assembly. You see, Bingley told me that you were close enough to hear me." Darcy thought to bang his forehead on the rock that had caused Miss Elizabeth so much harm. That she had heard the insult was not the issue. That he had uttered the lies was the problem. It was his mouth, not her hearing, which was at fault. Unfortunately, it was not only his insult at the assembly that harmed her. His not speaking up, each time Miss Bingley's venom was directed at Miss Elizabeth, was both unkind and ungentlemanly. She was kind. She walked 3 miles to care for Jane Bennet, spending most of her time in her sister's chambers, instead of seeking the company of 2 wealthy unmarried men. This said a lot about her character. Yet Darcy ignored the obvious, foolishly grouping her with the grasping females of the temps who connived to gain his notice. Idiot. Stepping over a puddle, he gently shifted his grip until her head rested against his shoulder. Suddenly, she inhaled deeply, a slight smile gracing her lips, as if the scent of his coat was pleasurable, and then settled back into the position. Were her senses engaged, though she was not conscious? "Miss Elizabeth," he whispered, "are you in pain?" What a ridiculous question. Of course she was in pain. He tried again. "Would sitting ease your distress?" He halted his steps, waiting for any sign of consciousness. When none came, he proceeded toward Netherfield. "If you can hear me, I pray you accept my heartfelt apology. As I said, Bingley told me that you heard my unkind opinion at the Meryton Assembly, that I thought you were merely tolerable, and not handsome enough to tempt me. What a horrible thing to say about a lady. I deeply regret what I said. As well, since you are aware that disguise is an abhorrence to me, you will understand how much I sincerely regret those words, because they were a lie. The truth is that I think you are beautiful. Oh, I heard your mother proclaim that your eldest sister is the beauty of the Bennet family, but she is wrong, very wrong. Miss Bennet is a classic beauty, and Bingley finds her quite attractive. I will give her that. However, when you walk into a room, every head turns to see you. Like you, I value intelligence and honesty. You have never failed to demonstrate either in my presence. Your loyally expending yourself to care for a beloved sister is a testimony to your character." He cleared his throat, lowering his voice, not wanting to alarm her. To ease his battered conscience and distract her in case she was able to hear, he confessed, "My worries on the night of the assembly were many. There was a matter of most serious concern that was tearing my heart into shreds. My sister, my own sweet, innocent sister, had encountered the vilest of men, a man who used to be one of my closest friends and companions. Georgiana had grown up with and trusted him as I once did. And here we come to one of my greatest sins, Miss Elizabeth." The pain in his heart felt like lightning bolts had hit him in the chest. He blurted out the rest.
My father left Georgiana under my protection, and I proved my son suitable. I made a conscious choice not to share the history of this man with my sister. I wanted to keep her untouched from the wickedness in the world. It was a bad decision. In doing so, I failed her. It was a mere chance that moved me to travel to Ramsgate a day early, stopping the intended elopement. Yes, Miss Elizabeth, as shocking as it sounds, my 15-year-old sister agreed to an elopement with a man almost 30, who has more charm in his little finger than I do in my whole body. Needless to say, the devastation that my sister continues to suffer is complete.
He looked at Miss Elizabeth again, in hopes she would wake up and tell him to stop, tell him she needed to hear no more. She remained silent, with no evidence that she heard or understood one word of his confession. His concern deepened. He picked up his pace. He was the only one distracted with his confession. Since it made the time pass more quickly, he finished his sorry tale.
My intention, after returning from Ramsgate, was to stay in town with Georgiana for the winter. However, at her request, I came to Hertfordshire. You see, my presence served as a constant reminder to her that our father's trust in me as a guardian was unmerited.
The hurt still filled his heart.
Certainly this is no excuse for the pain I caused you that night, as truly there is no excuse.
He carefully stepped over a protruding tree root.
But I hope you can see me differently. I will do all I can to prove to you that I am a man of honour, as I am trying to do the same with Georgiana.
Her breathing changed, and her eyelids flickered. He stopped.
Miss Elizabeth, can you hear me?
Lifting her hand from under his greatcoat, she rubbed her forehead with her delicate fingers. He could do nothing but hold her, speaking to her in quiet tones.
Miss Elizabeth, you have taken a fall. We are on our way back to Netherfield Park. Please, open your eyes. Please.
When she did, the first words out of her mouth took him by surprise. Mr. Darcy, where is your horse? Then she closed her eyes again in a faint. Chapter 2.
Elizabeth.
A moment of panic paralysed him. Weighing the danger of running to get assistance, or slowing to ease her discomfort, Darcy rested against the trunk of a fallen tree. Her eyes blinked rapidly, and then squinted, as if the fading sunlight was too harsh. She looked around, and he knew she was trying to gain her bearings. He waited until her gaze finally settled on his. Mr. Darcy. Her voice was soft, though her face filled with anguish.
Please, calm yourself, Miss Elizabeth.
He wanted to stroke her brow until it smoothed.
Do you recall how you came to be at the far side of the lake?
I do not, although I must have fallen. Again, her hand came up and touched her temple, pushing against the skin that must have been throbbing below the surface. There is no lake at Longbourn, sir. She frowned. My whole head hurts.
I am sorry you are in pain.
Darcy held her closer.
You slipped and fell. I came upon you soon after. Rather than leave you alone to run for help, we are on our way back to Netherfield Park.
Why there?
Your sister, Miss Bennet, fell ill while visiting Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst. You came to care for her, and have been here 2 days. There was no opportunity for you to walk out of doors this morning, so you left for your excursion after tea. I happened to be in the area also.
Is my sister well? She pushed away from him. If Jane is here, then I must return to her. She will worry. Oh, Jane is rarely ill. Why is she not at Longbourn? Why does she remain at Netherfield Park? How long have you been there? Mr. Darcy, I should not be here with you, and you should not be with me. And why are you carrying me? Put me down this instant. Her mind was clearly jumbled. He could see her determination, and knew she would endeavour to stand. Was it safe enough to let her try?
Before I do, pray tell me, how many eyes do I have?"
"You do not know how many you have? How unusual. I thought you to be a man of intelligence." She giggled. "One moment, and I will look. Let me see. You have only one eye. Cyclops! And you have 2 noses and 3 mouths. How are you able to eat? Is one for liquid, one for meat, and one for sweets? Odd, Mr. Darcy. I had thought you to be a handsome man. Now you look silly." He could not help but smile. Then she pressed her fingertips into her scalp, and his smile disappeared.
"We are in a bit of a muddle, Miss Elizabeth."
Her eyes had closed as she continued to rub her brow.
"My first instinct when I came upon you was to wait for help to arrive. The danger of moving someone who has sustained a blow to their head sufficiently to render them unconscious is worrisome. With that said, it shall soon be dark. Frost is in the air. It became too dangerous for you to remain at the lake shore. I have been carrying you, and will continue to do so. I estimate that we are already almost halfway back to the main house."
"I appreciate your effort." Miss Elizabeth opened her eyes. "Is the light dimming in the setting sun?"
"It is."
"Well, then it will get colder. You need your coat."
"We need to get you into a comfortable room with a roaring fire more than I need you to return my coat. Do not worry about me. The exercise is warming me."
Stepping away from the tree trunk, he continued toward the house. "Mr. Darcy, A drop of rain fell on her cheek, and they both looked up at the sky.
"Blast!"
Darcy held her tighter. Instinctively she reached around his neck as he picked up his pace.
"I apologize for any discomfort I may cause, Miss Elizabeth, but we must return to Netherfield immediately. It would not be good for you to be caught in a downpour."
As he spoke, the drops fell fast, drops that bounced off the forest floor. His hat protected his face from the rain, but Miss Elizabeth would be vulnerable. He pulled the arm across her back closer to him, until her face was pressed into his neck. Her warm breath soothed him. When she spoke, it felt like a kiss. "Do not be concerned, sir. I appreciate your caring for me, for I do not believe I have the strength to take a step on my own, despite Miss Bingley declaring me to be an excellent walker." He stared back around the lake. Though he had not run across the fields of Pemberley on anything other than on horseback since he was a lad, he could walk and carry a heavy burden for hours. The tenants on his estate knew him to be a man who did not mind hard work. The mud that lined the path on their journey from the house had become slipperier with the rain. Several times Darcy had to catch himself, as the ground under him seemed to slide away. Each time, the swift movements he took to recover jarred Miss Elizabeth, yet she never complained, only tightened her arms around his neck. Their progress was slow, and the roof of the house looked just as distant as it had been when they started. He felt dampness against his neck, and knew it was not the rain. Had he tasted it, he suspected he would have found the salt of her tears. He knew not what to do to ease her pain. What he did know was the danger of remaining unprotected in the cold, wet darkness.
"Pray, hang on tightly."
When he felt the muscles of her arms tense, he increased his pace. "My head is spinning," she whimpered into his neck. His heart ached for her pain. "Mr. Darcy, sir?"
"Yes, Miss Elizabeth."
He would offer her his all, if only he could ease her pain and get her to safety. "Sir, each time you move your head, the brim of your hat comes into contact with my temple."
Oh, good heavens! He was causing her pain.
He tipped his head back until the blasted hat fell to the ground. Stopping under another tree, he rested his back against the gnarled trunk. The only thing visible above the treetops was the smoke from Netherfield's chimneys.
"Is the world still circling inside your head?"
"Constantly," she whispered. "Please, I beg you, put me down. I fear I may be ill if we continue." Carefully he set her on the ground, where she leaned her head against the trunk of the tree, her eyes closed. Can you hear the ringing, sir?
I cannot.
She covered her ears, only to let her hands fall to her lap. Mr. Darcy, I wonder how you came upon me, sir. You are dressed in riding clothes, yet you have no horse.
What do you recall, Miss Elizabeth?
He had just decided not to ask, when it blurted out of his mouth. He rolled his eyes at his stupidity.
Why bring this up now?
She seemed to stare at him for a long while, and he felt uncomfortable that she did. He wondered if his constant gaze had made her feel the same. We were at the assembly in Meryton. After being introduced, Mr. Bingley asked Jane for a set. She paused. I believe you walked to the fireplace and stood as you are doing now. He held his breath. She had lost a whole month. The assembly was held exactly 1 month prior.
And this is all you can remember? You recall nothing else from that evening?
Miss Elizabeth closed her eyes, furrowing her brows for several seconds, until she shook her head slightly, making her flinch. No, sir. I remember nothing else until the moment I woke up here. Darcy wanted to click up his heels. She did not remember the insult. He wanted to hug her close. He was relieved and distressed. Did we dance, Mr. Darcy? He wished to tell her that they had. He wished he could fabricate a tale of the way he should have acted, rather than the way he did. His honour would not allow it.
No, we did not.
She opened her eyes and lifted one brow in a move that captivated him. Do you mind if I close my eyes? She asked. But please, talk to me, sir. I desperately need the distraction. I care not which subject you choose.
Then please make yourself as comfortable as possible.
Mr. Darcy, perhaps the better choice would be for you to go for assistance, now that I am settled.
Absolutely not.
While it may have been more practical for him to have done so, he could not leave her unprotected. We cannot be found here alone, sir.
Miss Elizabeth, is your father a reasonable man?
He is.
And as soon as you are safely at Netherfield, I will go to him to explain the circumstances. He is a gentleman, and will understand that I could not abandon you. I will not do so.
You must be terribly cold.
The exercise was quite invigorating. Do not be concerned.
Telling me not to be concerned will not remove my worry, sir.
And truly, I am well.
But Miss Bingley, sir.
Miss Bingley? Why do you speak of her?
Again, her brow wrinkled, closing her eyes, as if it made it easier to remember, or the pain of movement was too much to endure. Are you not attached? She stood close to you at the assembly, and seemed to look upon you with fondness, she asked.
Me, attached to Miss Bingley? No, Miss Elizabeth, that was not fondness you saw, but greed. She desires my wealth and the power that comes with the Darcy name, not me.
I beg your pardon.
We have been in company several times since I arrived in Hertfordshire. Sir William Lucas included both our parties at a gathering in his home, where I heard you sing.
She wrinkled her nose.
You have a lovely voice, Miss Elizabeth.
Darcy smiled at the memory. Her voice, the passion with which she sang, had filtered into his cold heart, melting a thin layer of the glacier that had grown steadily since his first appearance in society.
We also gathered at your aunt's home for cards. We later paid a visit to your family at Longbourn.
I do not recall any of those events. She rested her head cautiously against the tree.
I imagine you do not. The blow to your head was powerful. You were wearing a spectacular lump on the back of your head because of that rock.
He sucked in a breath, wondering how much to share with her. The last thing he wanted to do was overwhelm her. A lump, you say? I wonder if the fashionable ladies of the temps would consider this the newest form of headwear, although I doubt that they would want the ache that comes along with it.
What a woman! You amaze me with your frivolity, Miss Elizabeth. I know a few women, my sister included, who would not be sobbing with tears, begging for the constant attention of all.
He shook his head. When he added this to what he already knew of Elizabeth Bennet, her value grew exponentially. Why cry, sir? What would tears do, except make my eyes swell and you feel worse? My mother has used them for years to try to get her way, and I found her efforts rather tiresome. She was correct. Few things made a man feel more powerless than a woman's genuine tears, and enrage when they were not honestly done. I will rest now, if you do not mind. My stomach is still churning. I fear that if I were to attempt to move now, the consequences would be unpleasant.
Pray do, Miss Elizabeth. I will protect you from harm.
He watched her settle into the fabric of his coat, and thought of all that could threaten her. He fully comprehended the situation, and became aware of his most constant worry. She was weak and hurt. Darcy did the only thing he could under the circumstances. Quickly placing his arm behind her shoulders, and the other under her legs, he lifted her. Instinctively she wrapped her arms around his neck. He wanted to smile at her low grumble, but knew better. Instead, he headed towards Netherfield Park. Chapter 3. He had been walking only a few minutes when she spoke. You have made an enemy of me, Mr. Darcy. He felt her words whispering against his neck. How lucky his cravat was stuffed in his pocket.
I suppose so.
He wanted to smile, and this time he did not hold back. Although he felt terrible that his movements caused her misery, his admiration for her was higher than it had ever been for a lady. Does the thought of having me at enmity with you bring you joy? She asked.
That it does.
You are a strange sort of man, sir.
You think so?
His smile grew.
I believe I have in my arms a strange sort of woman.
Whatever do you mean, Mr. Darcy? He discerned her incredulity as he felt her brow furrow against the side of his face. Only then did he realise she would have felt his cheek move with his earlier change of expression. She did not need the light of day to know he had been happy at her words. He shifted her weight as they cleared the lake trail and started up the long incline to the house. Involuntarily, or so he assured himself, he pulled her even closer. Darcy forced his mind back to their conversation. She felt wonderful in his embrace. He sighed, determined again to strive to regain control.
It is a simple matter of reviewing the facts, Miss Elizabeth.
Again he felt her brow move, and imagined her lifting the right one as high as possible. At her groan, he asked,
Are you well?
You do realise that if my stomach erupts like Vesuvius, you will have a front row seat to my humiliation, sir. My head is pounding, and I long to be stationary. The trees above us are spinning in circles. Other than those particular maladies, sir, I am well. She gasped as he stepped into a low area hidden in the shadows of the fading light, the movement jarring her against him. She whimpered, However, you must know that the memory of our acquaintance is becoming clearer with each passing second. Our past has been turbulent. Would you not agree? However, your good deed in rescuing me is saving you. You were saying? A fleeting thought crossed his mind of how most females of his acquaintance would have reacted to being jostled with a knot almost the size of a large hen's egg on the back of their head. He shuddered at the thought.
I apologise for my misstep just now, and for my poor conduct in the past.
He felt more than heard her soft voice whisper for him to continue. He understood how distraction could temper the pain.
When we were at the lake, I apologised for my comments at the assembly, and I explained why I should not have been in company on that particular evening.
I clearly remember the insult. Your explanation I do not recall, sir. He heard the regret in her voice. She continued, I would have appreciated hearing your attempts at an adequate explanation.
Well, Miss Elizabeth, whether I was thorough in repenting of my sins, I know not, as you were not conscious. Had you been, I have no doubt you would have expressed your studied opinion on the matter with vigour.
Sir, you should be thoroughly repentant of your sins, whether I heard you or not.
I will not deny that you speak the truth.
He stepped around a narrow ditch.
You claim to be set against me. Nevertheless, what I do know for certain is that you have not been able to ignore me the whole of the time you have been at Netherfield. Your attempts to unsettle me by engaging in debates indicate more than words that you are not averse to me. Yet you hereby proclaim yourself my enemy. Do you not find that strange?
Averse? You believe that my arguing my opinion indicates that I do not strongly oppose you? You are the strange one, sir. He felt her stiffen. She inhaled swiftly as he began the long, arduous climb to the house. The uneven ground would cause her to suffer unduly if she was not preoccupied. A fine rage towards him would accomplish the task.
I called you intolerable at the assembly. You heard my insult.
Mr. Darcy, I cannot believe you would bring this up after you claim to have made an adequate apology.
Does it count if I claimed it when you did not hear it?
Mr. Darcy, she hissed. He hoped it was from irritation rather than agony.
Fitzwilliam.
Sir?
My given name is Fitzwilliam George Alexander Darcy.
His heart ached with her pain, but his mind rejoiced to have this private time together.
When my cousin or my sister long to vent their frustration against me, they use my full name. You have my permission to do so as well.
She huffed, and feeling her smile, he marvelled at her unexpected good humour. I would imagine it would be a regular occurrence. Was it something you heard from your parents as well? She asked.
For a certainty. From my father far more than my mother, though only when I was young.
There was silence, as she lightly pondered his disclosure. He felt her sigh. I am Elizabeth Rose Bennet when my mother is vexed. My father rarely refers to me as anything other than Lizzie. With that said, I believe that under normal circumstances, I would not hesitate to vent my anger against you, Mr. Fitzwilliam George Alexander Darcy. However, there is a blacksmith with a large hammer and an inferno burning behind my eyes, along with a butter churn in my stomach, which should give me leave to postpone my castigation against you for a more favourable time. He felt her nostrils flare against the side of his cheek. Then he felt the dampness of her tears on his neck. You have the looks of a gentleman, though your speech at the assembly declared you to be anything but. Nevertheless, your actions today revealed to me a different man than the one I assumed I knew prior to arriving at Netherfield Park. Something I also must consider is that I claim to be a lady, even though my hems were 6 inches deep in mud, and I dare to refuse to defer to you solely because of your position in society. While I have castigated you to my family and friends, what does that say about me?
Do not try to remove the weight of error from my shoulders and attempt to transfer it to your own, Elizabeth Rose Bennet. Doing so is wrong on every level. The guilt is my own.
Once she was safe and settled, and after she recovered and returned to Longbourn, he would move heaven and earth to learn from his mistakes, to be the gentleman he was supposed to be. Oh, Jane, prepare yourself for something dreadful. I cannot know what you will think of me once I tell my tale. Sitting on the bed next to her sister, she wove her hand through the crook of Jane's arm. Yesterday afternoon I went for a brisk walk around the lake. Unfortunately, in my haste to get through the mud, my feet slipped out from underneath me. I hit my head on a rock, rendering me unconscious. Mr. Darcy found me. We were too far from Netherfield Park for him to yell for help. After carrying me to the house, he requested that Papa come quickly. Of course, since you were already ill, Papa feared the news that your condition had worsened. You can imagine how shocked he was to find me in bed with a large lump at the back of my head. Mr. Darcy was pacing in the corridor. Within my hearing, Mr. Darcy requested to speak with Papa in private. I suspected that he would sacrifice his happiness by offering for me out of duty. You know that I will never marry without love and respect, neither should he. Because of this, I begged Papa to allow Mr. Darcy to be in my presence, so I could listen to his demands. You did not. Yes, dear Jane. I was frustrated with Mr. Darcy's need to make things right in his own way, without asking for my preferences. Standing, she moved to the window seat. As I expected, he insisted that I was compromised, and that since he was a man of honour, we would wed. Jane leaned closer. What happened then? I reminded him that Caroline Bingley would take every precaution to stop any gossip spreading about a possible compromise, since it would ruin her own goals to become Mrs. Darcy. Her family, including Mr. Bingley and his servants, would support her. Thus we should be able to escape the repercussions of our being alone together and his rescuing me. As well, I might have mentioned that he was the last man on earth that I could be prevailed upon to marry. No, you did not. I did. Elizabeth picked at the fabric of her skirt. Jane, I was in pain. I was frightened for my future. It was only later that I realised how kindly he treated me after my injury. The fact that his honour required him to offer for me, despite how low my situation was compared to his, engendered respect, something I never thought I would feel for him. Do you love him? Elizabeth did not hesitate to reply. I cannot say that I hate him any more, at least not as much as I once did. He's the sort of man that... Well, I cannot seem to find the words to say how I feel. As you are aware, respect is important to me. Where I will confess that there are a few things about Mr. Darcy that I like, I can say with absolute truth that I do not love him. Jane grinned. It must have been divine to be carried in his strong arms around the lake. Even with your figure being light, the task was arduous, something only a well-muscled man could have achieved. Jane Ann Bennet. Lizzie Bennet, do not be shocked. I have imagined being swept off my feet after I marry. What if the gentleman was not physically strong enough to lift me? I would die of embarrassment, and he would be ashamed. You know, there is something to be said about a handsome face, strong arms, long legs and broad shoulders. Mr. Darcy is a handsome man, who is all man from his wavy dark hair to his hessians. Elizabeth's blush warmed her skin. I do not want to think of him that way, and you should not think of him that way either. After all, you were interested in Mr. Bingley, are you not? Jane nodded. I understand. I will leave off complimenting Mr. Darcy's form, especially since I already experienced how powerful Mr. Bingley's arms were when he helped me from the drawing-room to this chamber. Jane, you said nothing to me about this. I know, and I should have, but it is the sort of thing I will forever hold dear in my heart. Lizzie, you cannot say that Mr. Darcy's strength did not make you feel cherished. Unless he was rough about carrying you, there is something very special about being cosseted and protected by a kind man's arms being about you. Did you not feel the same? Admitting her feelings to Jane was difficult, a new feeling for Elizabeth. Typically, they shared everything. I did. Lizzie, you should know that you were correct about there not being any talk, since I heard none of this, not even a whisper, and you know how much our mother loves to gossip. Since yesterday, I have had an abundance of visitors besides Mamma, Mary, Kitty and Lydia. This morning, Charlotte, Maria and Lady Lucas came to Netherfield Park to inquire about my health. Additionally, Mr. Bingley's sisters spent considerable time with me, asking many questions about your character. Of course I gave them a glowing report. I thank you for your reassurance, dear sister. Elizabeth climbed back on the bed to sit next to Jane. My head is throbbing. My vision is better today than it was yesterday, but I feel somehow, I do not know, bereft. Do you love Mr. Darcy, Lizzie? Do not overthink the question, nor prevaricate. Do you love him? Jane rarely pressed Elizabeth for anything, yet this time she was insistent. I no longer hate him, was her most honest reply. Well, that is a good start, I think. Jane mused. I wonder how he feels about you. He has to hate me for refusing his offer, I suppose. But, Jane, I just could not accept him. I have nothing to give him that he does not already have in abundance. I certainly respect him, as I already mentioned. Nonetheless, our acquaintance has had so many low moments that this one event might be the anomaly. I simply do not know him well enough to give him my affection. Mamma told me that Mr. Bingley plans to hold a ball in 2 weeks. Papa insisted that I would not be healthy enough to attend. Never give up hope, Lizzie. She wished she could be more like Jane, but to Elizabeth, hope never came easily. In their small circle in Hertfordshire, disappointment was far too common. She doubted she would ever see Mr. Darcy again. Chapter 4. March, 1812, Kent. In the spring, Elizabeth journeyed to her close friend's house, the Hunsford parsonage, which was attached to the estate of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Mr. Darcy's aunt. For 5 days she had relative peace, watching Charlotte, née Lucas, oversee her household and Mr. Collins, her father's cousin and heir, go about the business of shepherding his flock. However, the morning prior, Charlotte's husband rushed from his patroness Lady Catherine de Bourgh's presence to announce that her 2 nephews, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam, arrived for their annual stay. According to Mr. Collins, Lady Catherine was convinced that Mr. Darcy would finally propose to Lady Catherine's sickly daughter, Anne, resulting in celebrations that would be extended to encompass the great lady's parson, his wife, and their guest. Elizabeth scoffed. If she knew anything about Mr. Darcy, it was that nobody was going to tell him what to do. Had she not already tried and failed when she told him not to offer for her, and he did it anyway? Men. Later that evening, Charlotte invaded Elizabeth's chambers. Your distress with my husband's announcement was obvious. What happened between Mr. Darcy and you in Hertfordshire, Lizzie? Elizabeth lay back on the colourful quilt. Closing her eyes, she recalled the events of autumn. You will think I am silly, I have no doubt, since you are my most sensible friend. Do you remember my accident during my stay at Netherfield Park, when Jane was ill? What was not made known was that it was not a footman who found and rescued me when I fell. It was Mr. Darcy, who carried me almost the length of the park. Lizzie! I know, Charlotte, despite the fact that my fall was an accident, and there was likely to be no expectation resulting from a compromise. He explained to Papa that he would do his duty as a gentleman by offering marriage to me. Charlotte's hand shot to her mouth. Oh, my, Mr. Darcy? Yes, well, his focus on duty rather than tender concern, added to the pain from my injury, caused me to be as abrupt with my response as was his offer to me. Everything about the process felt cold and distant, like we would never be able to see the way to felicity. There was no possibility of my agreement. As you are aware, I did not attend Mr. Bingley's ball. The next day, the whole of the Bingley party, including Mr. Darcy, vacated the premises and never returned. Lizzie, it is likely that you will be in Mr. Darcy's company here. You will not be able to avoid him. I have already been in Mr. Darcy's company, Charlotte. The past 2 days he walked the same path as me. Tomorrow, though, I shall choose a different part of Rosings Park to explore. Lizzie! Elizabeth did not like the grin on her friend's face. Could it possibly be that he regrets your refusal? Charlotte asked. What? Of course not. Charlotte added, when you were both at Lucas Lodge, his eyes followed your every move. During the card party at your aunt's house in Meryton, he did the same. I suspect that if you were to ask him his intentions, he would have, perhaps reluctantly, shared that he was enamoured of you. Never. This is Mr. Darcy we're talking about, Charlotte. He is destined for someone of elevated rank, not a simple girl from the wilds of Hertfordshire. Longbourn is hardly a wilderness, Lizzie. Be that as it may, Mr. Darcy has no interest in me. Are you absolutely certain of that? Absolutely, Elizabeth insisted. He rarely speaks to me and never looks at me, so your speculation is flawed, Charlotte. Only in your dreams would Mr. Darcy genuinely care for me. I will promise that when we are forced together socially, we will meet as indifferent acquaintances. Thus Lady Catherine will have no reason to shun me as competition for her daughter's claims on the man. I do not know, Lizzie. Charlotte cautioned. "I think you are closing your eyes to an opportunity that few women would ever have. Do not be a simpleton by allowing your standards for what you demand in a marriage to make you appear unpleasant in the eyes of a man of 10 times the consequence of any unattached male in Hertfordshire. Do not be concerned, my friend. I only desire to keep my expectations from rising, when nothing at all will come from Mr. Darcy's being in Kent." Darcy had used every means of trickery to evade his cousin's inquiry. Richard Fitzwilliam had earned his rank as an expert in military strategy, so he knew exactly which questions to ask, to garner whatever information he needed. At the moment, he wanted to know Darcy's private business. "Am I not welcome to join you for a walk about the grounds? This is the 3rd day in a row that you refuse my company. If I did not know better, I would think I had fallen out of your favour. Yet that cannot be, for who would rescue you from the dragon's lair?" "Do not refer to our aunt as a dragon, Richard. I was speaking of Cousin Anne." Darcy was quick to divert Richard's attention back to the point of conversation. "I have a weighty matter to consider that is private, Richard. It is for this reason alone that I choose to stroll Rosings without your company. I do my best thinking in solitude." Darcy adjusted the perfectly tied knot in his cravat and swept a loose wave of his hair from his brow. He stepped closer to the mirror. Was that a spot Parker missed when he shaved him? No, it was a mere shadow. Richard Fitzwilliam leaned back in his chair, stretching his feet out in front of him. He was the picture of relaxation, until one noticed the piercing gaze and the grimness of his jaw. "Weighty matter? Is that what you call her?" His cousin arched his brow, in the same manner Miss Elizabeth had done any time she called his opinions into question. Darcy spun on his heel, his breath catching. "Her?" Sitting erect, Richard said, "Dark hair, tucked under her bonnet, pert chin, well, pleasing figure, good posture, walking as far away from you as possible on the forest path. She is not our cousin Anne, Darcy. Lady Catherine will be furious if she knows you were trying to flirt with someone who is not her daughter." "Trying to flirt? Whatever do you mean?" His cousin laughed. "My friend, from a distance it appeared that you were chasing, and she was running as fast as she was able." "Bah, you know nothing." Rubbing his hand over his mouth, Darcy paced. What should he hide from his most trusted friend? What could he reveal? After a moment's pause, he said, "Her name is Elizabeth Bennet. She is not a stranger to me." Richard nodded. "Ah, I see. I've heard her name from Anne. She's a guest at the parsonage, and a friend of Mr. and Mrs. Collins. How do you know her?" Sitting across from his cousin, Darcy said, "We met in Hertfordshire. Her father's estate is neighbour to the house Bingley leased. Because society was limited, we were often together. You should know that Bingley imagined himself in love at first sight with Miss Elizabeth's eldest sister. Yet my first impressions of the Bennet family showed them to be a crass and grasping sort. Thus, at the beginning, I did not present the best version of myself to any of them." "What did you do?" Darcy ran his hands over his face, pressing the heel of his palm into his brows. "I insulted Miss Elizabeth, to her face." "Good God, Darcy! I know you've long been uncomfortable in public when you're not particularly acquainted with others, but this is rather rude even for you." "Thank you, cousin," Darcy sneered. He swallowed the cooling tea, granting him time to compose himself. "I had no idea that Miss Elizabeth heard my insults. In fact, I forgot that I said anything about her at all. Several weeks later, while her elder sister and she were at Netherfield, Miss Elizabeth ignored me. I assumed she planned to increase my interest by acting completely opposite Caroline Bingley. I completely misread her, Richard. She was not attempting to curry my favour, nor was she trying to use arts and allurements to increase my affections. In my pride as Fitzwilliam Darcy of Pemberley, the premier potential bridegroom on the marriage mart for the past 5 years, I never suspected how much she resented me. Too bad, old chap. The least you could do is utter the words with a modicum of sincerity, Richard. Your grin is not appreciated." "Ha!
I happen to have it from several ladies that my smile is my most attractive feature, Darcy. You were just sour because, for the first time in your privileged life, you did not get what you wanted."
Slapping his knees, Richard stood.
"I like Elizabeth Bennet already. I take it that you do too."
Resting his head on the back of the chair, Darcy admitted,
"I do, very much. She is unlike any young woman I have ever met. She walked 3 miles from Longbourn to Netherfield to care for her sister when she became ill. 3 miles! She tolerated Caroline Bingley's venom with grace. When she expresses her opinions freely, they are well-studied opinions, Rich, and her laughter is delightful. Yet you chose to insult her to her face. How could you, Darcy?"
He felt his cousin's disappointment deep in his heart. There was no man Darcy admired or respected more than Richard.
"As you are already aware, there is no excuse that could satisfy any impartial judge. I will only state that the day was long and miserable. Bingley coerced me to go to that blasted assembly, the evening of my arrival in Hertfordshire. His sister was a burr caught on my... Well, I will not say aloud where it felt like she was caught, but nothing I did got rid of her. When we arrived at the assembly, the first words that I discerned in the cacophony were how tall and wealthy I was. Speculation about my annual income fairly raced around the room. Mothers paraded their daughters under my nose. I felt hunted."
Richard nodded.
"I've seen it many times in London. You, who want to be left alone, are suddenly surrounded by a press of ladies batting their eyelashes and swishing their fans to capture your attention. While Bingley loves it, you do not." "You do too, Richard. But you are correct. This time, however, the truth was that Mrs. Bennet threw her eldest at Bingley, a lady my friend delighted to catch. Then she backed away, not attempting to push any of her 4 remaining girls at me. At the time I was relieved. Now that I think about it, her conduct was odd. I was a single man with a fortune at my fingertips, and she did nothing to draw me in." "All 5 daughters are out?" "They are. Miss Bennet, I guess, is near Bingley's age. The youngest is the same age as Georgiana. And for certain all 5 do not possess the accomplishments that so many ladies in our sphere acquire from birth. Their father is indolent in his care of the family estate, and in overseeing the future of his daughters. Their mother is vulgar. But Elizabeth and her elder sister have risen above these challenges. They are ladies through and through."
Darcy sighed. Richard filled their cups. After sitting across from Darcy, he said,
"That had to be hard on you, having Bingley show you up for the first time." "What? No, not at all," Darcy fumed. "That never crossed my mind. I just wanted out of the assembly. I wanted privacy and quiet. Had I not known that Miss Bingley would have followed me back to Netherfield Park, I would have called for the carriage and left. Bingley was welcome to all the attention he could get." "I see."
Richard sipped his tea.
"How did Miss Elizabeth react the next time you saw her?"
Closing his eyes, Darcy easily recalled the scene.
"We were at Lucas Lodge, the former home of Mrs. Collins. It was quickly evident that the 2 eldest Miss Bennets and Miss Charlotte Lucas were intimates. Bingley singled out Jane Bennet like he was a sheepdog, and she was the prized lamb. Miss Elizabeth and Miss Lucas remained together the whole of the night. When Miss Lucas's father requested that I dance with Miss Elizabeth, she refused me by saying she had no intention of dancing. Since her younger sisters were making a spectacle of themselves, I assumed she was attempting to set a good example by tempering her natural desires to participate, in hopes of restoring Miss Kitty and Miss Lydia to better behaviour. I now know that she truly did not want to stand up with me." "You really made a muddle out of this, Darce?" "You do not know the half." "Oh, then tell me."
Darcy huffed.
"Elizabeth is exceedingly kind, with a gentleness that draws me to her. Her mind is quick. She is not mean-spirited. I sense that injustice angers her deeply, as it does me. When she smiles, which is often, her eyes light up like the sun." "Thus your insult would have cut her deeply."
Darcy hung his head.
"Yes."
"I'm curious, did she ever accept your offer for a dance?"
"She did not." Bingley held a ball on the last evening we were in Hertfordshire, because of an injury she sustained while walking a particularly rough path at Netherfield Park. Miss Elizabeth did not attend.
Quietly his cousin asked, "So you never had the privilege of holding her hand? Well, that is too bad." Standing, Darcy moved to the window overlooking Rosings Park's massive gardens.
I not only held her hand, but I also held her in my arms when I carried her back to the house after she fell on the path. With her hands wrapped around my neck and her head resting on my shoulder, I realised how well her heartbeat was in tandem with mine. I liked her before her fall, but at that minute I felt the beginning of love for the first time in my adult life.
What did you do then?
I requested the attendance of her father so I could honourably offer my hand in marriage.
Richard's eyebrows shot up, almost to his hairline. You were betrothed?
Not only did she refuse to dance with me, she soundly refused to marry me.
His cousin's mouth gaped open.
I, too, was shocked beyond belief.
Tracing a pattern on the carpet with the toe of his boot, Darcy continued.
She was injured. Her pain must have been incredible. I thought she lashed out because of this. 2 weeks later at the ball, I discovered from a crass comment made by her youngest sister that Elizabeth Bennet had no love for me at all, that she did not even like me. The next morning I left for London, with no intention of ever seeing her again.
How is that working out for you, Darcy? Here you are, and here she is.
Yes, she is here. Darcy sighed. For 4 months I tried everything to purge her from my mind and heart, but not once since late November has anyone else tempted me in the slightest. I find myself comparing others to her, and they always fall short. As it is, all it took was one glance 2 days ago to realise that I was done searching for my mate. I only want her, need her.
Well, Darcy, it sounds like Miss Elizabeth does not want or need you.
I know.
He rubbed the discomfort from his chest. What are you going to do about it? Just know that whatever you plan, I will support you. However, Lady Catherine and Anne will not. You are walking along a dangerous line here at Rosings Park, trying to court someone under our aunt and cousin's noses. Are you sure that this is the best field of battle? Would it not be better to wait until you are back in London? Or could you return to Hertfordshire when the lady goes home?
This is the only opportunity I have, Richard. I will not pass up this chance to make a better second impression.
Might I ask what you talk about during your walks?
Talk?
Darcy was flummoxed.
Like me, she enjoys silence when walking out of doors. We are each unwilling to speak unless we expect to say something that will amaze the whole room and be handed down to posterity with all the éclat of a proverb.
Of you I can believe this, Darcy. Of her? I do not know her. With that said, it sounds as if you do not know her well either.
I intend to remedy that neglect.
You have already walked with her twice by your own account. Do not wait too long, cousin. Seize the day. Carpe diem. Chapter 5. Within 10 minutes of taking the path veering off to the right, Elizabeth gazed in wonder at the visage in front of her. Daffodils, crocus and daisies dotted the verdant field, opening their blooms to the warm sun. Birds filled the air with song. Bees danced from one petal to the next, sipping nectar from each plant, and a babbling stream wound like a ribbon through the glen. The morning mist vanished, leaving behind the fragrance of healthy soil and the freshness of spring flowers, and no sign of Mr. Darcy. Grinning from ear to ear, she removed her bonnet. Facing the sun, she silently praised the Creator as the rays warmed her with peace and contentment. Elizabeth wished she had tucked a book in her pocket. Here she might rest under an oak with newly open leaves, enjoying the quiet sounds of nature as she read. The setting was perfect for poetry. Flinging her arms wide, she recited Wordsworth's "I wandered lonely as a cloud" aloud as she turned in a slow circle. I wandered lonely as a cloud, that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. Applause stopped Elizabeth. With the sun behind her audience, Elizabeth could not see their faces, but from his posture she recognised one immediately. Mr. Darcy. He found me again. Elizabeth was torn. In spite of what she said to Charlotte, she was not displeased to see him. Since he rescued her, the danger to her heart was real, something she could not share with her friend. The truth was that she had been devastated to miss Mr. Bingley's ball, the one time that she would have gladly said yes, had Mr. Darcy asked for a dance. Where she had been angry at him, she now saw his fine qualities. What a hopeless case! She focused her attention on the smiling man at Mr. Darcy's side as they strode toward her.
Miss Bennet, my cousin Colonel Richard Fitzwilliam of the Regulars. Cousin, this is Miss Elizabeth Bennet of Longbourn in Hertfordshire.
A pleasure, Miss Bennet. The Colonel bowed elegantly. Elizabeth curtsied, using the occasion to gather her wits about her. Quickly donning her bonnet, she tied the ribbons so tightly they pinched the skin under her jaw. I beg your pardon, gentlemen. I was unaware I had company for my performance. Hoping the men would think the heat in her face was the result of exposure to the sun, Elizabeth stilled her pounding heart by forcing herself to inhale slowly. The Colonel replied, "Oh, do not be distressed. There is nothing so lovely as a pretty lady enjoying the delights of nature." Ah, a flirt! Unwittingly, Elizabeth compared him to the silent man standing next to him. The Colonel was not as tall, nor as handsome, yet his face and countenance were approachable and friendly. "Thank you, sir." Mr. Darcy said, "You read Wordsworth?" "You seem surprised," she teased, her purpose being to unsettle him. "This begs the question, Mr. Darcy. Do you not think that a lowly daffodil is worthy of being extolled in poetry, or should only roses earn the privilege?"
"I do believe a daffodil is deserving."
A slight grin appeared at the corner of his mouth.
"I am on to your game, Miss Bennet, for it was my copy of Wordsworth you borrowed from Netherfield's library. I know the poem well."
She felt instant embarrassment. She hated it when her younger sisters borrowed items of hers without asking permission. To do the same to someone else, even inadvertently, was shameful. "I was not aware that Wordsworth was your book, sir. Mr. Bingley offered the free use of his library, so I assumed it was his. Had I known that it was not, I would have asked permission from you." Before Mr. Darcy could reply, the Colonel's long legs ate up the distance to a nearby tuft of daffodils. Instead of grabbing a random handful, he chose 3 lovely flowers, picking them low to the ground. Removing his handkerchief from his pocket, he wrapped the bottom of the stems so the sap would not drip on her hands or gown before handing them to her. She had no words. His spur-of-the-moment action surprised and enchanted her. Burying her nose in the petals, she enjoyed the sweet and almost spicy scent. "I thank you, good sir."
"My pleasure, Miss Bennet."
Extending his arm, he said, "There is a particularly excellent view of a small waterfall at the edge of the glen. I would be pleased to show you the way." Elizabeth could not help but see Mr. Darcy's scowl. Does he not want me to walk with his cousin? Or is his jaded eyesight blinding him to the beauty of the day? She had no clue. Wrapping her fingers around the bend of the Colonel's elbow, they happily meandered to the far end of the glen. Colonel Fitzwilliam was amiable, an excellent conversationalist who told outrageous stories to make her laugh. He was everything a gentleman should be. Still, she wished it was Mr. Darcy's arm she held. Not for the first time, Darcy wanted to growl. How dare Richard, picking her flowers and making her smile. A lover does those things, not a new acquaintance. Hurrying to catch up with them, Darcy knew he must do something to draw Miss Elizabeth's attention away from his amiable cousin. But what? For the first time in his life, he was the pursuer, not the prey. Wait, that was not the truth, since he pursued her around the lake. Thank heavens that he did. How could he make her like him? What were her interests, other than her family, who were not in Kent? Coming to a standstill, he considered everything he knew about her, which was far less than he thought. She liked poetry, stimulating conversation, and spring flowers. She often dressed in shades of blue or yellow. Were they her favourite colours? He had no clue. She would rather walk than ride. Why? Had she never learned? Or had she been injured by a horse, so that she was afraid to try riding again? He loved the joy of galloping across a grassy field, with the wind in his hair, controlling a powerful animal with a slight touch. How could she not love the same? Miss Elizabeth held her eldest sister in the highest affection. Why? Was it the gentleness that Jane Bennet most often displayed? Was Miss Elizabeth overly protective of those she loved? Whatever the reason, Darcy tried to see in the eldest Bennet daughter what Miss Elizabeth saw. Was it the same thing Bingley saw? Two facts motivated Darcy to keep Bingley from returning to Hertfordshire. First, in the few minutes he studied Jane Bennet, he had seen no outward preference for Bingley. It was easy to conclude that the lady was being forced, by her avaricious mother, to pretend an affection that was not there, for the sole purpose of attaching herself to Darcy's wealthy friend. Second, should Bingley marry Jane Bennet, there was no possible way Darcy could have stayed away from Miss Elizabeth. They would have met several times a year, since Bingley was a social creature. All Darcy could think at the time was that she was a danger to him, and she did not want him. Holding himself still, he pondered his situation. Her caring for Jane Bennet during her illness, the way she protected her sister from the Bingley sisters' intrusion, and the way she praised her sister to Bingley, was evidence that the affection between the siblings was genuine. She loved Jane. She did not love him. If the eldest Miss Bennet was heartbroken over the loss of Bingley, Darcy was convinced that Elizabeth Bennet would tear him to shreds if she knew he was responsible. He was a dunce, and completely undeserving of her. His chest felt empty. His limbs were weak. Why did he think he was an expert when it came to romance? He, the man who believed Miss Elizabeth flirted with him, only to realise how little she valued him. And how could he have thought himself to be elevated above her? To himself, he quoted oft-repeated words from his father. "You are the grandson of an earl, the son of a most deserving woman, and a Darcy by birth. In this you are blessed." He was a fool, standing in the middle of a field, choking on his prideful arrogance, while his cousin and best friend acted the gentleman to the worthiest woman on planet Earth. An idiot he might be, but he was no quitter. Squaring his shoulders, he moved to intercept the couple. Pleasant memories of spending time with his young sister resulted in him bending to gather a handful of daisies. Pinching his thumbnail in one end of the stem, he wove a flower through the hole, one after another, until he was able to wind the chain into a circle, the perfect size to fit around her wrist. Was he silly? Whether he was or not no longer mattered. "Pardon me." He moved to stand beside her. Extending his hand, with the flower bracelet resting against his palm, he said, "For you, my lady." She looked up at him, her free hand at her chest, her head tilted to the side. He could see the question in her eyes. "For me?" "For you." He bowed, wanting to kick himself for his past attitude. He was singularly responsible for her believing that he was not a gentleman. He was determined to fix his errors.
Deer used a narrow trail to a small wooden bridge over the stream that provides the best view of the falls Richard mentioned. We will need to walk one behind the other. Richard can take the lead, since he knows the trail as well as I do. I will follow."
She hesitated. "That is a lovely suggestion. I thank you, Mr. Darcy, for the daisy bracelet." Dropping her hand from Richard's arm, she walked behind the Colonel. Working together, he and his cousin kept low-hanging branches and brambles from getting in her way. When they finally reached the stream, the view of the small waterfall was blocked by a tree that must have fallen during the winter. The only clear view would be from the middle of the bridge. However, his aunt had not maintained the overpass. Moss was growing in patches on the surface. Some of the boards were rotted on the ends, while others looked sound enough. Before he could sound a warning, Elizabeth hurried to the top of the bridge. "Oh, what a delightful setting for a waterfall! Thank you, gentlemen, for bringing me here." Turning back to them with a smile, she said, "You were correct. This is everything lovely." Resting her hands on the railing, the boards crumbled under slight pressure. "Oh, no!" When she stepped back, her foot slid on the damp moss.
"Miss Elizabeth, do not move. The bridge is unstable."
She did not say anything, but the fear in her eyes told him everything.
Richard offered, "There looks to be some solid boards. From here we should be able to guide you where to place your feet."
Darcy intended to consult with his cousin to plan the safest path for her to take back to them. When she shifted her weight back from the railing, the sound of breaking wood impelled him to act. With 4 giant strides, he was almost at her side. Leaning forward, he did not see the moss in front of his other foot. By the time he was aware he was in trouble, his back foot slipped, throwing his weight forward. The plank did not hold. Down he went, his right leg plunging through the hole toward the water below. Pain shot through his knee when it hit the sharp edges of the broken board. His fingers gripped the handrail, keeping him from dropping completely into the running water.
"Darcy!"
Richard yelled. She screamed, "No!" The pain was excruciating. When she stepped closer to him, he begged her to stop. "Mr. Darcy, neither of us can remain where we are." She trembled. As Darcy took a hard look at his situation, Richard directed her steps.
"Miss Bennet, we need to get you off the bridge before Darcy can be rescued. Pray, listen carefully, and move only where and when I tell you."
Focusing on her, rather than on his pain, Darcy's pulse accelerated as she drew close. When her fingers rested on his shoulder for a brief touch, his whole body calmed. Once she was on solid ground, Richard turned his attention to him.
"Darcy, can you pull yourself up and slide backward until you reach the stronger boards?"
The pain in his knee was beyond imaginable. Splinters pierced his buckskin trousers, from the top of his hessians to his thigh, as well as the palms of his hands, where he gripped the railing. Even moving a hair's breadth tormented him. He was embarrassed from landing in a heap in front of her, and miserable from his injuries. Yet her sweet voice encouraged him. Slowly and steadily, he followed his cousin's direction. After what seemed like hours, he lay back on the bank of the stream, with his head resting on her lap. Richard had pulled off his boot before taking his knife to Darcy's trousers, cutting the torn buckskin up over his knee to ease his discomfort from swelling. Once his injuries were fully exposed, he tied Darcy's cravat and his own tightly around the knee to stop the blood. Then he ran to Rosings Park for help. Her fingertips brushed over his temple. Darcy closed his eyes and willed his pain away, until the only thing he could sense was her. Chapter 6. How rapidly Elizabeth's circumstances changed. Her intention to avoid Mr. Darcy that day turned into a complete failure. If the circumstances were different, she would be well pleased to be in his company. The poor man. The skin surrounding his knee was brutally damaged. Deep, bloody scrapes ran from mid-calf up to his thigh. The skin not currently covered by both gentlemen's cravats and handkerchiefs was already scarlet red with purple undertones that were darkening by the minute. She feared he would never be able to walk without a limp. Thankfully, Colonel Fitzwilliam was experienced in dressing wounds. Besides experience, the flask containing spirits was a welcome relief to Mr. Darcy. Fortunately, when Elizabeth took it from the Colonel and opened the lid, it was full. Before leaving for Rosings to get assistance, Colonel Fitzwilliam commanded, "Miss Bennet, by the time I return with help, you are to get every drop of that liquid down Darcy's throat. I want nothing but fumes remaining. Am I clear?" "Yes, sir." She smelled the strong spirits. Elizabeth had no desire to sample the beverage. "That cognac comes from the Grand Champagne region of France. It is potent enough to dull the pain of a dumb ox, so it should work for Darcy." Resting his hand on his cousin's shoulder, he warned, "Behave yourself." To distract herself, she said, "Your cousin cares for you deeply." Mr. Darcy turned his face to her. "We have been close since our youth. Richard is 2 years older than me, but I was always taller than him, so our ages made no difference until I became an adult. At that point, my cousin considered himself my superior. Whether that was from the actual age difference or the fact that he was used to commanding underlings, I do not know. He is like a brother to me." "Would you be willing to take another sip, please?" Never could she have imagined having contact with him at this level. Still, she clearly recalled his strength when he carried her to Netherfield Park. The sharpness of the stubble that grew since his valet shaved him that morning, and the woodsy scent of his skin, the softness of his hair. She remembered it all like it was yesterday. Elizabeth felt his forehead, pleased to discover that his skin was still cool to the touch. Fortunately, the sun was at her back, so her body shielded his face both from the heat and exposure. Surprised when her fingertips tingled each time she touched him, Elizabeth reached under the back of his neck to hold his head up as she put the flask to his lips. "I believe that it is to your advantage to obey the Colonel. You know better than I how far we are off the main trail. A wagon or a cart will not be able to reach us easily. Dulling the pain now will be to your benefit." "I will be well." "You will you?" she asked, amazed at his ability to minimize his trauma. He might not be complaining aloud, but she felt his body flinch with each slight move. "Miss Bennet, I am entirely ashamed that my actions are causing you discomfort," Mr. Darcy whispered through gritted teeth. "Oh, do not dare be concerned about me, sir. When you carried me from the lake, I had a mere bump on my head. If only I could toss you over my shoulder and get you to Rosings Park as quickly as you got me to Netherfield. The fact that I cannot is the only thing causing me discomfort." It pained Elizabeth's heart to see anyone suffering. When added to the memory of how much worse her situation would have been had Mr. Darcy not helped her at Netherfield, her admiration grew. "You cannot believe that the situation is the same. As a man, I am the protector. As a woman, I am a nurturer, sir. This means the difference between the sexes is very small when there is a need that requires being filled. As you felt a responsibility to me when you found me hurt, I feel the same for you, Mr. Darcy. We are discussing human kindness, are we not?" "I suppose." "Please, if you would take another drink, I will explain myself." He obeyed. "Had you found one of the milkmaids from the local dairy unconscious on the trail at Netherfield, would you not have done all within your power to help her?" "Without hesitation." "I agree that you would have, sir. The simple fact that you endeavoured to help Mr. Bingley learn to run his first estate indicates your willingness to be of assistance to someone in need. In the same manner, had an injury occurred to one of Lady Catherine's grooms, or Mr. Collins's gardener, I would do all within my power to provide aid. Where we differ is the amount of power we possess. Where you carried me with seeming ease, I would struggle under your weight." She barely heard his chuckle. "Some more, Mr. Darcy?" She again held the flask to his lips. "A question for you, sir. Who taught you how to make a daisy chain?" "My mother died when my sister was born. Georgiana had a nurse, who was brought in from Lambton.
the village closest to Pemberley. Molly was the eldest of 8 children. The other 7 were boys who had no idea what to do with a big sister, other than treat her as a second mother. By the time Molly was old enough to go into service, her character was as bold and adventurous as her brother's. At the same time, she knew far more than me how to bring joy to the nursery. My father was right to hire her. You see, Georgiana is extremely uncomfortable around strangers.
Like her brother? Elizabeth asked.
No, she is timid, where I am not.
Stiffening her spine, she asked, Then your reticence is because you do not want to be bothered by strangers?
Miss Bennet.
He sighed.
Please, imagine yourself in my place, if you would. You step into a crowded assembly where you know no one other than your hosts. The very first words you hear are speculation, guessing your annual income. Then your morals are called into question, as strangers wonder what relationship you have with the sister of your host. Immediately following are commentaries about your hair, your clothing, and whether or not you were the one who purchased Caroline Bingley's ostrich feathers and jewellery.
I understand your point, sir. Before I make another wrong assumption, perhaps you might have another swallow of your cousin's fine brandy.
Before I do, I wonder, did you ever recall anything I said when we were by Bingley's Lake, in between when you fell and when you woke?
Shaking her head, she had no clue what he was talking about. No, sir. We conversed.
Actually, no, since you were unconscious. However, I took advantage of the opportunity of speaking without witnesses to apologise for my grievous error at the Meryton Assembly. I never should have said such thoughtless words. That my words hurt you is repugnant to me.
I see. She thought back to that day. She remembered nothing from the time her feet went out from underneath her until they were on their way back to the house. I do thank you for your apology, although I do not remember anything you said. Was it well done? He grinned.
Certainly. Never let it be said that Fitzwilliam Darcy ever does anything by half measure. When I insult a lady, it is thoroughly done. When I apologise, I need to be even more exhaustive with my efforts.
She giggled. Mr. Darcy, did you happen to break your fast prior to walking out today?
I did not. Why do you ask? Have the bears and lions started growling in my stomach?
Not at all. At Netherfield Park you drank brandy on several occasions with Mr. Hurst and Mr. Bingley, yet not once did you giggle. His tone and countenance were indignant.
Giggle? Me? Miss Elizabeth Bennet, I will have you know that a Darcy never giggles.
His face relaxed.
Well, except for Georgiana. When she was quite young, I used to lift her and toss her high into the air. I think the first word she ever learned to utter was more.
My father did the same to all 5 of us. Not at the same time, of course.
Of course.
He swallowed brandy without being asked.
She has not been happy for many months. I told you why by the lake.
When I was unconscious?
Yes, I'm afraid so.
He held out his hand for the flask, and then took a long swig.
Did you happen to receive an introduction to George Wickham, an officer with the militia stationed in Meryton?
Not until after you and the Bingley family were gone. My younger sisters considered him to be a friend, until he became betrothed to Miss Mary King. At that point they seemed to lose interest in him. He no longer accompanied the other officers when they came to Longbourn. Mr. Darcy groaned as he adjusted the position of his leg.
Once I am back on my feet, I will contact Miss King's family. Mr. Wickham is not to be trusted. He attempted to take advantage of my sister's lack of guile to steal her dowry. I stopped the elopement, rescuing my sister from harm. Nevertheless, her trust in her judgment is damaged, seemingly beyond repair.
Poor Miss Darcy. Elizabeth pressed her fingers to her lips. Oh, no. Mary King's uncle learned of an inheritance not 1 week after the militia's arrival. Do you suppose Mr. Wickham is after her money instead of her?
I have no doubt.
Oh, this is terrible. She is an orphan with an uncle who is too busy to look out for her best interests. Who will protect her from Mr. Wickham?
I will.
Mr. Darcy attempted to sit up. Elizabeth grabbed his shoulders, pulling him back until his head again rested on her lap. "Mr. Darcy, you can write to my father soon enough. He will get the message to Miss King's uncle. For now, you need to remain still, so your wounds do not begin bleeding." He took a long swig from the flask. Shaking the container enough to gauge the amount of liquid remaining, he immediately took another drink. "Thank you for wanting to protect Miss King, sir. You must have been aware that Mr. Wickham was in Hertfordshire, or you would not have asked if I had been in his company. Why did you say nothing about his propensity for evil while you were there? My sisters are as important to me as yours is to you. Had he not engaged himself to Mary King, Kitty and Lydia especially would have been in danger." He dipped his chin, then whispered,
"I should have said something."
"Yes, you should. Ladies need protection."
"I apologise."
"For?" His voice slurred with the effects of the brandy.
"For not being the gentleman I was brought up to be. For insulting you, and for not warning the citizens of Meryton how devious Wickham could be. For keeping you sitting on hard ground. For compromising you by having my head in your lap."
He snickered like a schoolboy before sobering.
"For trying to forget you these past 4 months, like Bingley tried to forget your sister, and failing spectacularly. For all the other things I have done to alienate you and harm you, Elizabeth, Miss Bennet. I have so many regrets. Thus I beg your forgiveness."
The emotional impact of his words stunned her, until the only thing to come out of her mouth was, "Forgiveness is granted. Now, rest, please, sir. It should not be much longer before your cousin returns." Chapter 7. When he took another drink, instead of closing his eyes, Elizabeth asked, "What did you mean when you said that Mr. Bingley tried to forget Jane? Does he still think of her? My sister called on Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley in London, only to have them end any chance at friendship. Are you saying they did this without consulting their brother?" Mr. Darcy rubbed his face with his free hand, after pulling the glove off with his teeth. He groaned, this time apparently not from discomfort.
"Tell me plainly, did your sister hold Bingley in affection?"
"You have to ask." Elizabeth was incensed. She did everything within propriety's restraints to show him how much she valued him. Yet he walked away, exposing Jane to the censure of the world for her disappointed hopes. My sister was, and still is, crushed. Mr. Darcy tipped the container to his lips and drank until there was no more. Wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, he tossed the flask aside. His voice was so quiet that she needed to lean closer to hear.
"For as much as you hated me after my insult to you, I fear you will loathe me even more, and I tell you that I, along with Caroline Bingley, convinced Bingley that your sister was merely following the direction of your mother to attach herself to a wealthy man."
Elizabeth yearned to pinch his earlobe hard enough that he yelped. She would have, too, had he not already been so miserable. "If I were not such a sympathetic soul, I would toss your head to the ground, hoping you would hit a rock hard enough to knock some sense into you. How could you not see Jane's attachment? And how could you hurt Mr. Bingley like that? Shame on you, Mr. Darcy."
"Yes, shame on me."
He hiccuped.
"This is not my finest hour, Miss Elizabeth, or Miss Bennet, or would you mind if I just called you Elizabeth? It is how I always think of you."
"Are you drunk?" she huffed.
"I think I must be."
He mumbled.
"If that cloud looks like something other than a bunny getting ready to hop away, then I suspect I have had too much to drink. Blast Richard! Somehow or some way this must be his fault. But I will fix this, just like I will fix Wickham. Wretched Wickham is what I call him in my mind. He is the most wretched person I know. Do you think I am wretched, Elizabeth?"
Glancing up at the sky, there was no white fluffy rabbit visible. Rolling her eyes at their current situation, she was unsurprised when Mr. Darcy's eyes slid closed. Hopefully the time would pass more quickly if he slept. The Colonel was wise to give him alcohol. Anything that would dull the pain when the men tried to move Mr. Darcy was worth having him incapacitated now. The trip back to Rosings Park would jolt and jar him terribly. If only Mr. Darcy could sleep through it, but she doubted it. In the meantime, what was she to do about him? She was so angry with his interference that she would gladly slap his jaw if he were not already so miserable. And that was another thing. How could she be angry at a man who apologized with genuine remorse? Ugh! He was a conundrum, likely to send her to Bedlam if she spent any more time in his presence.
"Elizabeth, are you better now?"
he asked softly, but did not open his eyes.
"You were in terrible pain when you left Netherfield Park."
"From my fall?"
"Yes."
The headaches and dizziness lasted far longer than I wanted, but the nausea was only that day and the next. The pupil of my left eye stayed bigger than my right eye for weeks, it seemed, although I refused to look in a mirror. What lasted the longest was the confusion, the feeling that my brain was filled with London fog. Eventually, I recalled leaving Netherfield Park for a quick stroll around the lake, and I remembered you escorting me back. I wish I heard what you said to me while I was unconscious, Mr. Darcy, but I do not." He opened his eyes, his dark sapphire gaze directed at her, and warmed her insides more than the sun.
"Would you like to know what I remember most about that day?"
"What do you remember most about that day, sir?"
"Your eyelashes."
He had to be well and truly inebriated to say such a thing. "Indeed?"
"Yes, ma'am. They lay against your cheeks, and they looked so long and thick that I wondered if you would have the strength to lift them after your injury. My fingers ached to touch them, to see if they were indeed as weighty as they appeared. Proudly I will tell you that I restrained myself."
She laughed. "Oh, Mr. Darcy, unlike me, I fear you will remember everything about this situation later, once the alcohol wears off, and you will think your tongue is unhinged."
"I told you, or I think I told you, that I tried to forget you, Elizabeth. You are my Achilles' heel, I fear."
He reached up to clasp her fingers in his.
"I will never forget this day. I will always think upon it with pleasure."
His eyes closed again. His breathing deepened. Within moments the tension left his muscles, until he relaxed completely against her. To the emptiness surrounding them she said, "I sincerely doubt that I will forget this day as well." Darcy ached from his elbow to his toes. His knee throbbed in time with his heartbeat. The rough ground underneath him pressed into his backside, causing further discomfort. Where was Richard? What was taking him so long? He listened to hear any signs of his cousin approaching. Someone was humming a slow melody in minor notes. He smelled honeysuckle, his favourite spring flower. His mother? No. Blinking, the lady's face was angled away from him. Strong jaw, pointed chin, slender neck. Elizabeth. Closing his eyes again so she would think he remained asleep, he marvelled that she continued to hold him close. What did it mean? Was it Christian kindness, or did it signify something more? He needed to see her face. Shifting slightly, misery shot through him with the first flex of his muscles. Gasping from the pain, he held himself still, only to realize that the sun had shifted while he was asleep, adding to his agony. The warm rays shone directly upon his face. How long had he been asleep? Good Lord, had he snored? "Sir, I can hear the approach of a cart. Can you hear the wheels?"
"Indeed. Evidence that my aunt does not maintain Rosings to the extent she claims."
Darcy grimaced.
"First the bridge, Now the cart. What will be next, I cannot imagine.
Well, let us make a game of it, Mr. Darcy. I guarantee that it will make the arrival of help seem faster. I guess that the next sign that Lady Catherine has been remiss is that the shelves in the closets of the parsonage will sag.
Shelves in the closet? Why would my aunt do such an odd thing? How are garments supposed to hang with shelves in the way?
Miss Elizabeth laughed. You shall have to ask your aunt. Now it is your turn to guess.
I know. There is a statue of Diana the Huntress in the largest fountain north of the main house. Diana is reaching behind her shoulder for an arrow from her quiver. She has a stag in her left hand. I guess that the antler will break, whereupon the deer will fall into the fountain. She will be left standing without prey. Forevermore, visitors will be left to guess whether she hunted a rabbit, a fox, or something else.
You have given an excellent guess. My question is, where does the water currently spout from? Diana, the quiver, or the deer?
The deer's mouth.
He joined her laughter.
The water would shoot up and hit her outstretched hand, spraying everyone within reach.
How displeasing for your aunt. Well done, Mr. Darcy. It is my turn. I suggest that the next sign that Lady Catherine does not maintain her home to the standard she claims is that the bottom of the walking stick falls off when she bangs it sharply on the floor.
Never. I've seen her collection. She would claim it is a flaw in the stick rather than the unladylike demand she makes.
She makes demands of you? Oh, do not answer. That was too impertinent for me to ask. I beg your pardon, she said. Elizabeth's face was as red as a ripe tomato.
Do not be embarrassed, please. The simple answer to your question is yes. For as long as I've known my aunt, she insists that everything she says, thinks, or does is the only correct way. For example, after my father died, my aunt insisted that it was my mother's greatest desire to unite Pemberley and Rosings. I would need to marry my cousin Anne, which I will never do. Although I've told my aunt and cousin repeatedly that I have no intention of offering for Anne. The first thing out of Lady Catherine's mouth when Richard and I arrived was the date she could have her parson begin reading the banns.
He shook his head, the fabric of her skirt rustling underneath his head. It was such a pleasurable feeling, and he wanted to do it again. Well, then my question to you, Mr. Darcy, is if we were to play the same game about Pemberley, what would need to be repaired that you refuse to see?
Why, nothing.
He grinned.
I'm teasing, of course. When a grand house is built from stone that is centuries old, there are constant repairs. The difference between me and my aunt is that I do not ignore them. If a structure like the bridge is in ill repair, there are signs posted, and it is roped off.
That is good of you, sir.
Elizabeth, Miss Bennet, Pemberley is more than a house to me. The land and the buildings reflect my past, my ancestry. The picture gallery is filled with men and women who lived there and loved there. Children were born, and older ones died. In my almost 28 years, I have a wealth of memories in almost every room.
Elizabeth asked, "Which is your favourite room?" Without hesitation he replied,
"You might think it would be my father's study or Pemberley's library, which houses an outstanding collection. But it is the nursery. You see, I clearly recall the many times my mother would pop in, irritating my tutors when she interrupted my lessons. She would hurry me to gather my walking boots and coat. Then we would run through the fields to the Greek Folly at the top of the hill overlooking the property. My father would be there. Like me, he was a tall man, with long arms. I would sit between them. He would wrap his arms around us, and then tell us about our history. After a long while I would return to the nursery like nothing happened. Yet somewhere in the room was hidden an object from the day, possibly a bird's feather, a smooth rock, or a pretty leaf Mother found. How she arranged for it to arrive ahead of me I still do not know. But I will never forget those years, nor will I forget that room.
How wonderful to have those memories to comfort you, especially after losing your parents so young. Does your sister have memories like that?" He exhaled.
"I do not know. I left for Eton soon after she was born. During the summer months, when I was not at school, Father trained me to manage Pemberley. Georgiana was brought from the nursery for only a few minutes each day. Only after our father died did I start to learn her preferences. Her shyness, added to my being consumed trying to handle the responsibilities that came with my new position as master, means that I do not, in actuality, know her at all. Therefore I am certain I did not take care of matters with Wickham in the best way for her. I do not know what to do."
"Where is she now?"
"She's lived with Richard's parents since Ramsgate, since Wickham."
"Is that by her choice or yours?" Closing his eyes, he shook his head.
"Mine? Was I wrong?"
Twisting his head, he looked directly at her. "In truth, I do not know, since we have never met. Nonetheless, hearing you speak about her, her character is much the same as Jane's. My sister would have felt punished if she had been sent away to live away from her family. Even now, as much as she enjoys our aunt and uncle in London, she is aware this is temporary. As soon as I depart here, we will travel together to Hertfordshire. I must admit that wherever she is, she would be miserable because she feels she did something wrong to chase Mr. Bingley off, which affects her future and that of Longbourn."
"What do you mean? How would that affect Longbourn?"
She squeezed his hand, reminding him that her fingers were still entwined with his. 4 daughters who are all out are easier to support than 5. When each of us marries or finds a position, the burden on Longbourn is substantially less. Jane feels deeply that she is unwed at 23. She fears being like Charlotte, who did not marry until she was your age. Not only does it take money to feed and clothe a child, but anything also spent on the eldest cannot be used by the youngest. Lydia complains most vocally at being misused."
"I see."
Disregarding the pain, he sat up, turning to face her.
"I hear my cousin giving orders, so they will be upon us shortly. Before they arrive, I need to ask if you would be willing to start fresh."
"To become friends? Certainly, Mr. Darcy." She squeezed his fingers again, then let go, withdrawing her hand. He desperately wanted to take it back. "You have promised to act to protect Miss King and all Meryton by informing my father about Mr. Wickham's propensity for treachery. Also, should you tell Mr. Bingley that Jane is miserable without him, then you will be responsible for the happiness of 2 kind and gentle people. These are acts of amity, sir. I would be happy to consider you a friend." He dipped his head before gazing upon her lovely countenance. They were so close. If he leaned in slightly, and she did as well, their lips... He cleared his throat.
"What I meant was, I wish—"
"Darcy!" Richard yelled, warning them of his approach. Before Darcy could continue, Elizabeth stood, stepping back from him. The moment was lost when 4 men approached with a hastily arranged stretcher. He was soon being carried between the men, and Elizabeth trailed behind. She finally approached him after he was loaded into the back of a pony cart. Handing the empty flask to Richard, she said, "He did as you commanded, Colonel. The flask is empty, and I did not touch a drop."
"Might we give you a ride back to the parsonage, Miss Bennet? The day has been traumatic for us all, and I'm certain my cousin would be more comfortable should you join him in the back."
"Oh, very well." His cousin smiled before handing her into the back of the pony cart, and then climbing onto the front bench to drive. With a flick of his wrists, the cart jerked forward before settling into a fairly easy ride. Enough padding was provided so that Darcy's leg was fully supported, and he rested his head on Elizabeth's lap. He noted that Richard's daffodils were gone, but the chain of daisies remained on her wrist, gladdening his heart. Darcy loved her. There would never be anyone else for him but her. Cursing himself for leaving Netherfield Park, for not waiting until Elizabeth recovered, he vowed not to live his life with any more regrets when it came to her. He would do everything in his power to make things right with Bingley and Jane Bennet, He would write to her father to warn the residents of Meryton about Wickham's propensity for causing damage. Then he would pursue her to the ends of the earth if needed, until she fell as deeply in love with him as he was with her.
Miss Elizabeth, I need to tell you something of critical importance. Please, would you lean closer?
Their eyes met. When she was close enough that only she might hear, he whispered,
I wish that you would love me.
Despite the misery that shot through him with every turn of the wheel, Elizabeth's lovely lips parted, and her fine eyes opened wide. She gave him hope. Upon returning to the parsonage after his accident, Charlotte warned her that Lady Catherine would likely refuse to invite guests to Rosings Park if Mr. Darcy's wounds kept him bedridden. Her friend's words were prophetic, since Elizabeth returned to Jane in London without news of Mr. Darcy. The Colonel did not even come to the parsonage to inform them of his cousin's progress. The day prior to Elizabeth's departure, one of the maids happened to overhear a remark, indicating that Mr. Darcy suffered from a high fever caused by an infection. The Colonel remained at his cousin's side, as did his aunt, which was where they needed to be. Had Mr. Darcy felt these same worries when he left Hertfordshire after her fall? Did he wonder if she made good progress in healing? Had he been as frantic as she was? If so, then his relief at discovering her in good health in Kent would have lifted his spirits. Was that why he sought her out on the walking trails? She had so many questions, and no one to supply the answers. Chapter 8. July 1812, Derbyshire. 4 long months passed since Elizabeth was in Kent. Almost daily she asked herself what Mr. Darcy could have possibly meant when he said he wished she loved him. Was he so grateful for her comforting care that he imagined himself besotted? Was that the cognac talking? Or could he be seriously inclined towards her? After she had returned to Longbourn, she was barely able to eat. Sleep was impossible. Each time she closed her eyes, the sound of the wood breaking under his weight woke her in fright. As the days passed without any news, Elizabeth took it upon herself to warn her father about Mr. Wickham. She spared any personal details, only suggesting that her father inquire amongst the shop owners as to any uncollected debts that could leave local businesses in distress when the militia left for their next assignment. The results were as Mr. Darcy reported. Tales of loose living and debauchery guaranteed that the officers would no longer be welcome at Longbourn, much to Elizabeth's happiness and her younger sister's displeasure. The engagement between Mr. Wickham and Miss Mary King was terminated. During the ensuing months, she scoured the gossip columns, hoping they reported Mr. Darcy's re-emergence into society. Nothing. Fortunately, there was also no mention of Mr. Bingley's attaching himself to someone other than Jane. Had Mr. Darcy been able to speak with his friend? Elizabeth just wanted to know something, anything. She heard from Charlotte only once, exactly 2 weeks after Elizabeth left Kent. Charlotte duly reported that the Colonel removed Mr. Darcy from Rosings Park to his London house for treatment from the Fitzwilliam family physician and surgeon. What followed was a list of complaints to Charlotte from Lady Catherine about her nephew's absence, since she considered herself an authority on everything, even wound care. Mr. Collins was frustrated that his patroness did not trust him with news of the happenings of her household. Elizabeth was ashamed to admit that she felt the same. If only someone, anyone, would let her know about Mr. Darcy. The opportunity finally came when Edward and Madeline Gardner arrived at Longbourn. "Come with us to Derbyshire, Lizzie. We will tour the peaks and lakes before travelling to Lambton, where I was raised. We can tour some of the great houses, like Chatsworth, Matlock and Pemberley. Do say you will come." Elizabeth could not believe the offer was being made to her instead of Jane. Before her Uncle Gardner could change his mind, she replied, "Yes, I would be happy to accompany you and Uncle." Edward and Madeline Gardner were excellent people. As the younger brother of Elizabeth's mother, he understood the chaos reigning in Longbourn's parlour. Over the years, they often had the two eldest accompany them on their travels. This time, Jane would remain behind to care for the gardener's 4 children. Elizabeth would finally have an opportunity to discover what happened to Mr. Darcy. In truth, nightly she dreamed of him, striding purposefully toward the gardener's carriage, extending his hand to assist her from the conveyance. Or he would see her strolling Pemberley's gardens from a distance, kick his horse to a gallop to join her, slide from its back, and warmly welcome her and her family to his estate. She hoped her dreams were real. When she asked the servant at the inn in Lambton whether the Darcy family was in residence, the only reply she received was a "No, ma'am." Elizabeth lived for 4 months with anxiety bearing down upon her. Of course, she excused her concern as being Christian kindness, treating others as you would have them treat you, nothing more. It was not as if she was in love with him or anything. Impossible. Elizabeth scoffed. Only to herself did she admit that she cared about what happened to Mr. Darcy. But how much did she care? Did she love him like he had asked? She simply could not say. Tying the dark blue ribbons under her bonnet, she donned her gloves. Within the next 30 minutes, she would see Pemberley, at last. Her Aunt Maddie was just as eager to see the estate, but for entirely different reasons. "Lizzie, I've not been to Pemberley since my father sold his apothecary business to Mr. Smythe, the year before I married your uncle. Although we were all impressed with Chatsworth, Pemberley is equally grand, or maybe grander. Of the Darcys themselves, I've never met the son or daughter. However, I was in company with Mr. and Mrs. Darcy on several occasions, and observed the conduct of their son. When Papa attended to Mrs. Darcy during her illness, she always made me feel welcome. Her son, the present Mr. Darcy, was at least a decade younger than me, yet he was a polite boy, very quiet, and very concerned about his poor mamma. Once a year after the harvest, the Darcys hosted a celebration. The whole community was invited. There was music and dancing, games for the children, plenty of food, and gifts for everyone. In fact, I think I still have a doll I received from Mrs. Darcy when I was about 8 years old. I think it is in a box in the attic. I shall need to check when we return to London. My memories of this place are pleasant. They boarded the hired barouche with a collapsible hood, and Elizabeth sat opposite her aunt and uncle, tucking the skirt of her favourite day dress under her legs, in case a breeze blew into their uncovered vehicle. She waited to see if her aunt would say more about the property, or the family. Instead, her aunt asked questions that Elizabeth hoped to avoid. "Tell us about Mr. Darcy, Lizzie. Your letters reported that he was in Hertfordshire last November, I believe. What sort of man is he?" Elizabeth's hands trembled. Tightly squeezing her palms together to keep them still, she measured her breaths to slow her racing heartbeat. Where she had thought of Mr. Darcy daily, she had spoken of him to no one, not even Jane. She trusted her aunt and uncle implicitly. Nevertheless, she was unable to put her feelings into words. Therefore she reported occurrences as she remembered them. "My first impression of him was that he was the most prideful, arrogant person I had ever met." She paused. "No, I'm not correct. That impression came later. In truth, my very first impression was when he entered the Meryton Assembly with Mr. Bingley and his family. He stood at the back, surveying the crowd. Mr. Darcy is strikingly handsome, very tall, with broad shoulders. His hair is dark and wavy. His blue eyes are piercing. What struck me was how unhappy he looked to be at the assembly. Where Mr. Bingley was all smiles, his friend appeared to be dour. It was not until months later that I learned the reason for his discomfort." "What was it, Lizzie? Was he in ill health?" "No, Aunt. You see, whispers of his circumstances met him at the door. Mamma and Charlotte's mother were loudly guessing his annual income and how they might benefit by throwing one of their daughters at him." "Oh, no, Lizzie. The poor man." Her aunt sympathised. "And poor you must have been mortified." How like her aunt to consider the reactions of others, which was why Elizabeth strove to be like her in conduct and attitude, rather than imitate her mother. Edward Gardner, a businessman of excellent repute, added, "Oh, do not distress yourself, my dear ladies. It is often this way.
For has not my sister always said that a single man in possession of a fortune must be in want of a wife?"
"Yes, uncle." The reminder of how often her mother's conduct embarrassed her added to Elizabeth's discomfort.
He continued, "And I must say that it worked well for me. Within a month of receiving the first revenue payout from my initial investment in the shipping business, I met my sweet Maddie. After 12 years, I cannot imagine my life without her."
She patted her husband's knee. 13 years, my dear." Her uncle blushed.
"Oh, you are correct as always."
As they entered the park surrounding Pemberley, Elizabeth could not help but note the warm affection and respect between Edward and Madeline Gardiner. She knew that they shared everything. Her uncle routinely discussed his business with his wife. She supported him in every way possible. Elizabeth yearned to have the same level of closeness in marriage some day. Her aunt gestured toward the approaching structure. "Once we cross this bridge, we are on Pemberley Estate." The park was large, containing a great variety of foliage. They entered at one of its lower points and drove for some time through a beautiful wood that stretched across the western border of the valley. The road wound through the valley, tracing a path next to a wide lake, where ducks paddled and swans glided over the pristine water. Elizabeth's mind was too full for conversation. Every view was stunning. In the distance, she could see a man and a lady astride two powerful mounts, galloping across the field. Peering as closely as possible, it was easy to determine that the man was not Mr. Darcy. "What do you think of Pemberley?" her aunt asked. Turning in her seat, Elizabeth gaped at the sight. Pemberley. Situated above the valley, surrounded by a ridge of forest-covered mountains, sat a large, handsome stone building. Holding a hand to her chest, she said, "I have never seen a place for which nature has done more." Her uncle noted,
"Or where natural beauty has been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. You did not exaggerate, Maddie. Pemberley is superior to both Chatsworth and Lyme Park." Impressions overwhelmed Elizabeth. How Pemberley perfectly reflected its master, Mr. Darcy. Stately, handsome, and powerfully built, just like his house. Without closing her eyes, she could still recall the strength in his arms as he carried her back to Netherfield Park. When they descended the hill and crossed a bridge over a stream that ran from behind the house to the lake, the apprehension of finally learning what happened to Mr. Darcy unnerved her. Surely he had to be well, for who else had the skill to manage such a property? Her heart was in her throat when they pulled up to the door. On applying to see the place, they were admitted into the hall, and Elizabeth, while waiting for the housekeeper, had leisure to wonder at her being where she was. Through the window at either side of the front door, she admired the lovely prospect. As they were guided through the public rooms of the house, from every window there was beauty to behold. The rooms were lofty and handsome, and the furnishings suitable to the fortune of their owner. Where Longbourn was cosy, Netherfield Park formal, and Rosings extravagantly gaudy, Pemberley was elegant. Running her hand over the waxed surface of the grand staircase banister, Elizabeth's emotions warred within. She wanted to be in Mr. Darcy's house, to satisfy her curiosity about his lifestyle, and to get to know him better by surveying his surroundings. At the same time, she wanted to rush away, before she learned that he continued to suffer, or that he cared nothing for her. Strolling through the long picture gallery, Elizabeth stopped in front of a large painting of a younger Mr. Darcy, likely done soon after he left university. Her aunt asked, "Is this a fair likeness, Lizzie?" "It is." The artist captured his subject's chiselled features, including the warmth of his eyes. "He is more mature in his looks now, Aunt. I suspect that this is likely a result of carrying the responsibility of his estate by himself." The housekeeper asked, "Do you know my master, miss?" This was it, the moment when she would learn Mr. Darcy's fate. Breathing deeply, Elizabeth replied, "My family estate is only 3 miles from Netherfield Park, where Mr. Darcy was a guest of Mr. Bingley and his family last autumn. I saw him again in Kent this spring." The housekeeper's hands flew to her cheeks. In almost a whisper she asked,
What did you say the name of your family estate is, miss?" She had not said, of course, but there was no harm in sharing the information, so she said, "Longbourn." The housekeeper asked for her name. "Miss Elizabeth Bennet." The elderly woman gasped, "Thank the Lord." Grabbing Elizabeth's hand, she glanced at Mr. Gardiner. "Come with me, all of you, I beg you." Pulling on Elizabeth's hand, they hurried down the grand staircase, through an arched doorway, down a long corridor, only to stop in front of a set of heavy French doors. "My name is Maud Reynolds. I've been employed at Pemberley since the master was 4 years old. I've never had a cross word from him in my life. If I had travelled throughout the world, I could not have met with a better master. I've always observed that those who are good-natured when young are good-natured when they grow up. Mr. Darcy was always the sweetest-tempered, most generous-hearted boy in the world. I would do anything for him. The rest of the servants here and at Darcy House in London feel the same." Elizabeth was astounded. What happened to cause this loyal servant to plead for her assistance? For in every way, that is how matters felt to Elizabeth. Before she could gather her composure, Mrs. Reynolds rapped on the door. "Enter." Her breath caught. It was him. Chapter 9. Blinking, he stared at the woman in the doorway, afraid she was an apparition. His housekeeper's voice sounded as if she was speaking from a distance. "Sir, I believe this young lady is known to you."
"Yes, she is known to me."
Was that croaking sound coming from his mouth? Her loveliness robbed him of his breath. She looked wonderful. But everything about her appearance in his home mortified him. For as much as he wanted to be in Elizabeth's presence, he wished to be more composed, healthier, stronger, able to stand on his own 2 feet without a cane.
"There is nothing for it, man."
Clasping the handle of his cane, pushing against the chair's arm with his other hand, he stood slowly, the sounds of the leather fastenings on his knee brace echoing in the room. Would she shrink away from him, now that she saw how much less of a man he was since his accident? Would she only look upon him with pity? He could not look at her eyes, because they would reveal the truth. It was difficult enough with Georgiana fussing over him like he was an invalid. Bitterly, he admitted that in comparison with his activities prior to the accident, he was debilitated. "Mr. Darcy?" She curtsied. He was afraid to bow too deeply, fearful that he would lose his balance and fall on his face in front of her. Darcy felt like an insect under a microscope when her gaze started at the floor and stopped at his knee. He looked away, not able to stomach the disgust he assumed he would see. The carpets, and her inherent gracefulness, muted her approach. The softness of her touch, her fingers brushing his temple like they did in Rosings Glen, stunned him. He closed his eyes, his breathing far too rapid for her not to be aware. "Thank God that you were alive. I heard nothing, not one report. I worried that something dreadful happened to you. I am pleased to see you looking so well, Mr. Darcy." His eyes shot open.
"You think I look well, Elizabeth?"
Every ounce of his pain cloaked each syllable.
"I am barely able to walk. I can no longer sit a horse. I cannot dance. I am only half—"
Although her eyes filled with tears, she chuckled softly, boldly interrupting him. "And we both know how much you enjoy dancing, do we not?" Her smile was genuine, as was the single tear trailing down her cheek, sending a message to his heart that she was not being flippant. He touched her sleeve. She was real.
"Miss Bennet, will you stay at Pemberley, with your friends, of course?"
He had not meant to ask, at least not yet. Her surprise said more than words that he was precipitous, but he needed to know if he had hope. He refused to believe that she would not think him good enough for her, despite that fear churning in his gut. His morning began as bleakly as every other morning, since Aunt Catherine informed him that no one at the parsonage asked about his recovery. No one wondered if he still lived. When Richard and Georgiana left for a ride after breaking their fast, He tried to be happy to see his sister's smiling face, but he was miserable. And now that Elizabeth was here, a ray of hope stood in front of him. He desperately needed her. Thus he would do everything in his power to make sure that she never left. "Might I introduce you to my favourite relatives?"
"It would be my pleasure."
She turned, wrapping both hands in the crook of his arm, providing stability. "Uncle and Aunt Gardner, this is Mr. Darcy, Master of Pemberley. However, he is so much more than that. You see, what you do not know is that Mr. Darcy saved my life in late November of this last year. I slipped and fell while I was a very long distance from Netherfield Park. He found me unconscious, carried me back to the house, and arranged for my care."
"I did nothing that any gentleman would not do."
She peered up at him through those thick lashes. "Do not be modest, sir. You are my hero. This can be said of no other man, so you should enjoy the praise." Her smile lit his heart on fire. He completely forgot that his housekeeper and her relatives were in the room.
"Would you be agreeable to staying as a guest at Pemberley, Mr. and Mrs. Gardner?"
Once they agreed, he said,
"My cousin is here, who Miss Bennet already knows. My sister came from London to provide care. Will you allow me, or do I ask too much, to introduce Georgiana to you?"
She looked to her uncle, who nodded.
"We would be delighted, to both."
Darcy felt the weight of the world lifted off his shoulders.
"Mrs. Reynolds, please put Miss Bennet in the blue guest suite, and Mr. and Mrs. Gardner in the yellow chambers next to her. The rooms further down the hall can be prepared for the Bingleys' arrival on the morrow."
"Yes, sir." Darcy's housekeeper said to Mr. Gardner, "If you are staying at Lambton's Inn, I will send someone to settle your account and gather your belongings. I do understand if this is something you would like to do yourself. However, it truly is no imposition." Mrs. Gardner replied, "We shall remain with our niece, then."
"Tea shall be served momentarily."
Mrs. Reynolds closed the door behind her. Whatever moved her to bring Elizabeth to him, Darcy had not a clue. However, he would double his housekeeper's monthly salary for her diligence. Without a word, Elizabeth handed him the cane next to where he had been sitting. Gritting his teeth, Darcy attempted to be as smooth as possible when moving to the sofa. Putting all his weight on his good leg, he moved the canes forward before taking a tentative step. His movements were as slow as a tortoise, and as ungainly as a duck on land. Once he was seated, which was another exercise in excruciating difficulty, Elizabeth placed the canes on the other side of her, out of his sight. "Can we speak of your injury, sir?" Elizabeth asked. Even though it was the last thing he wanted to discuss, did she not know that she could say or do anything she wanted?
"The damage to the kneecap and the tendons surrounding the knee was extensive. My aunt's surgeon attempted to amputate. My cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, never left my side until he could move me to London, away from the man. Needless to say, the journey was challenging. My physician was singularly unqualified to treat this sort of injury. My cousin turned to the surgeon who served in his regiment. With his help and laudanum, the doctor put as much back in place as possible. Where my aunt's doctor said I would lose my leg, my cousin's surgeon said I would always have a limp along with a measure of discomfort. As you can see, I kept my leg."
"Is there anything else that can be done?" Mrs. Gardner asked.
"When the pain and swelling get too bad, ice is applied to the area. I am to move it as much as possible to keep it from stiffening. I will say that so far this treatment is working. For the first 3 months I wore a splint to keep my leg immobilized. At the same time the doctor had me move and stretch my muscles. Now I have a brace for support and use these canes to be mobile. He estimates that it could be 6 months to a year before I am able to put my full weight on my leg without it causing further damage." "Do you have restrictions, then?" Mr. Gardner asked. "I am to avoid climbing stairs, bending deeply, and any activities that place a strain on my knee."
"Then we are not taxing you?" Elizabeth asked.
"Never."
Darcy sat back on the sofa, stretching his mangled leg in front of him.
"Mr. and Mrs. Gardner, your niece told you that I was her hero. What she failed to mention was how dutifully she cared for me after my fall. If anyone is a hero, it is Miss Bennet."
The rosy hue of her cheeks added to her beauty. She peered up at him. Her eyes were limpid pools that he would gladly drown in. "Sir, do you not recall why you were on that rickety bridge in the first place? It was to rescue me from my impulsive decision to cross. Do not be modest. My dearest family can bear the truth."
"I would much rather bear the pain than have you suffer."
Mr. Gardiner said,
"I'm grateful for your intervention, Mr. Darcy. If only you had escaped the accident unscathed. This brings up a matter of concern. You were not expecting our arrival. At the same time, you are anticipating guests tomorrow. As I am aware, you have been friends with Mr. Bingley and his sisters for several years, so the precedent should be theirs. Your offer of hospitality is gratefully accepted, but we do have comfortable rooms at the inn. Perhaps it would be easier on you if we returned." "I thank you for your consideration, but you are most welcome here."
Darcy wondered how to bring up an issue that concerned him.
"I would ask about your eldest niece, Miss Jane Bennet. How is she?"
Mr. Gardiner nodded slowly. His wife's eyes narrowed as her husband asked,
"I find it interesting that you ask about our Jane, after mention was made of Mr. Bingley. Would I be correct to assume that Lizzie informed you of her sister's response to your friend's abandoning Netherfield Park, and Mr. Bingley's sister's cruel treatment of her?"
"Yes, I am aware." Mrs. Gardiner said, "Jane is unchanged, although she sheds fewer tears, and has finally begun to smile again."
"I see."
Darcy hesitated to explain himself. However, they had been speaking plainly since Elizabeth entered the drawing-room. There was no sensible reason to discontinue the process, since their conversation was the information they all seemed to need.
"While Miss Elizabeth and I waited for help to arrive, if my memory serves me well, we spoke about many subjects critical to the happiness of others. This included Charles Bingley and Miss Jane Bennet. Something you should know is that Bingley has great natural modesty, with a stronger dependence on my judgment than on his own. I misunderstood Miss Jane Bennet's motives. Thus I did not advise him properly. Until I went to Kent, I was unaware of how wrong I had been. Once I knew, I was not in the position of being able to have company. I was very ill. I am also a private man, so the only ones who knew of my difficulties were my family. Months passed when my only thought was how to handle my problems, my sorrows. By the time Richard brought me to London, Bingley had travelled with his family to Scarborough, and then to Manchester to stay with relatives and oversee his business investments. I did not know how to contact him. I was informed a week ago of his plans to journey here. At the time, I thought to clear up the matter of my misdirection once he arrived." "Very good," Mr. Gardiner said. "Now, tell me about you and Lizzie, if you would. Or we could wait until the ladies are no longer present, if you prefer."
Darcy glanced at the woman seated at his side. She was not the sort to appear missish. No, instead, she met his gaze with directness. "Your niece captured and held my attention when she cared for Miss Bennet at Netherfield Park. Oh, do not get me wrong. At first I was irritated once I realised that she, of all ladies, intrigued me. I was forced to reflect on my own prejudices when she fled the house in anger. You see, the conversation in the drawing-room was unfavourable. No, it was blatantly unkind to the Bennet family. Instead of defending our neighbours, I remained silent, much to my shame." "Unkind, you say?" Mr. Gardiner sat forward in his chair. "Why would you treat our Lizzie poorly?" "Your question is fair, and not unexpected, Mr. Gardiner. I am in no doubt that my reply will not paint my character in good light, and I apologise in advance for it. You see, it was not until we talked privately at the lakeside that I began to understand her character truly. Until then, I allowed my first impressions of her mother and younger sisters to influence my opinion of the entire family. Now I realise I'm being blunt, since this is your sister and nieces of whom I am speaking. However, their conduct in public was difficult to overcome. Of course, I now comprehend how poor my conduct was. By the time I was in Kent,
I was finally able to see the sterling qualities of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet's 2 eldest daughters, and I was able to see how horrible I acted in Hertfordshire. Well, then I will ask you, what do you intend to do about it?"
Darcy liked Mr. Gardiner's straightforward manner. He could now see where Elizabeth's willingness to face issues directly came from, and it pleased him.
"I will lay my faults in front of Bingley soon after he arrives. Since it has been months since I have been in his company, I no longer am certain how he feels about Miss Bennet. At that point I will do as I should have done at the beginning, and step back, attempting not to influence him in any way." "Well, that will be good for Jane, I hope. What about Lizzie?"
Darcy smiled, then turned to face her. Studying her face, inch by inch, his eyes kept being drawn back to hers. Without thought, his thumb brushed her brow, and then touched the tips of her eyelashes.
"They look so heavy. How are you able to hold them up?"
Her giggle lightened his heart. When she batted them like Caroline Bingley did, for the first time in months, Darcy laughed. Sliding his hand over hers, he traced her thumbnail with his fingertips.
"Mr. Gardiner, my mission in life is to do everything in my power to become a man who knows how to please a woman worthy of being pleased. There is no one on earth who I want to please more than Elizabeth."
"Very good, then." Mr. Gardiner glanced at his wife before adding,
"We are happy to accept your invitation to remain at Pemberley."
Darcy was delighted. Chapter 10. Her uncle stood, holding his hand to his wife.
"Come, Maddie, these young people have much to discuss that I have no desire to overhear. Still,"
addressing Mr. Darcy, he said,
"I fully expect the door to remain open while we are gone." "Agreed."
Elizabeth's heart pounded so loudly she feared the others could hear. Where she had been grateful for her uncle and aunt's presence, she was even more pleased that they were gone. Yet eager anticipation for what the gentleman next to her might say, and how it would affect her future, had her insides quivering. "Mr. Darcy," she began, only to have him interrupt her.
"Fitzwilliam, please. You have been Elizabeth in my mind since Hertfordshire. We have shared too much to continue being formal."
When she nodded, he said,
"Pray, allow me to go first. You see, I've been waiting since the spring to see you again. Once it was determined that I would have difficulty walking, I pushed myself harder than the physician asked me to, so that one day I could stroll alongside you through a garden. I would hold on to you, and you would hold on to me, so that neither of us would fall. I have dreamed of being at your side, Elizabeth."
She did not know what to say.
"My Elizabeth."
His head turned away from her.
I am not yet the man I used to be."
She rested her fingers on the back of his hand. "Fitzwilliam, I know you refer to your recovery, but please understand that you are exactly the man I wish for." The storm in his eyes when he looked up at her pierced her soul.
"I do not know what to say,"
he whispered. Covering her hand with his, he said,
"My lady, when we were at the lake after your fall, and at Rosings after mine, we both freely expressed ourselves. In so doing, there was little misunderstanding between us. Thus I beg you to be honest and tell me, please, did you ever think of me?"
Her heart was full of him. Unbidden tears clouded her vision. She blinked them away, not wanting anything to come between them. When a tear trailed down her cheek, he used the pad of his thumb to brush it away.
"Do not weep, Elizabeth. I have overwhelmed you. I apologize. Please do not cry."
"No, do not apologize." She smiled tremulously. "Not a day passed that I did not worry about you. Besides your health, there were times when I read an item in the circulating paper, or when a particular subject came up for discussion that I longed to share with you. I wondered," she bowed her head, "if you ever thought of me." From the door, a man loudly cleared his throat.
"Miss Bennet, how wonderful to see you at Pemberley."
Startled, she slid away from Mr. Darcy. Then she peered behind her to discover who dared to interrupt this precious moment. Colonel Fitzwilliam. Was that Mr. Darcy who growled in frustration, or me?
"Richard, I did not expect you back from your ride so soon."
"I see that." There was a mischievous glint in the Colonel's eye, along with a devilish grin. "You two shall have to pursue your tender courtship later, Darcy. Georgie ran upstairs to ready herself for visitors, when we spotted Bingley's carriage entering the park. Even from a distance we could hear his younger sister ordering the coachman to travel faster. You should expect their arrival within the next quarter hour." It felt like the bottom fell out of Elizabeth's stomach. Miss Caroline Bingley at Pemberley? Ugh!
"You are getting dust on the floor, Richard. Perhaps you need to follow Georgiana's example before Mrs. Reynolds sees the trail of dust you're leaving behind you."
Darcy struggled to stand. Instead of offering help, the Colonel remained in place until his cousin gained his balance. With a wink at Elizabeth, he left.
"Blast!"
Darcy watched him walk away, then turned toward her.
"Before the Bingleys and Hursts arrive, I wanted to ask you."
The housekeeper hurried into the room. "Mr. Darcy, sir, a carriage has been spotted entering the park."
"Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds."
Elizabeth was barely able to restrain her laughter. "It seems, Fitzwilliam, that whatever it is you would like to ask should be done directly, or I fear that my aunt and uncle will return, and your sister will be here, along with the Colonel, even before the Bingleys arrive." The corner of his mouth tipped up, showing the dimple in his left cheek.
"You are likely correct. My dearest Elizabeth, would you accept a courtship, a very short courtship from me?"
Without hesitation, she stepped closer to him.
"Yes." "With the goal of marriage?"
His smile grew when she moved even closer. "Of course." Leaning forward, she rested her hands on his chest.
"Might we seal our bargain?"
"How?" Elizabeth whispered.
"Like this."
Lowering his mouth to hers, she felt his breath on her lips, just before, "Darcy, oh. It appears my timing is not as perfect as I always claim." Colonel Fitzwilliam smirked. Regretfully, Elizabeth dropped her hands and stepped back.
Never mind."
Turning on his heel, Darcy's cousin vacated the room as quickly as he entered.
"I shall make him pay,"
Darcy reassured her, his sigh of frustration as great as hers, when one maid after another began bringing in refreshments for the newcomers. The precious moment was lost. Darcy owed his cousin. Richard rode out to meet the Bingleys. Stopping the driver, Richard told him there were sheep in the road ahead, then directed them to pull into an area overlooking the lake until the sheep herders had an opportunity to clear their path. By the time the carriage arrived, Georgiana and the gardeners returned to the drawing-room, and introductions were made. Standing in front of the empty fireplace, where he faced the door, Darcy welcomed Elizabeth's presence next to him, her hand wrapped around his elbow in support. He set his canes behind him. In this way, he had the dignity of not leaning on his canes when the Bingleys and Hursts entered the room. Miss Bingley's eyes swept the area before settling on him. "Mr. Darcy, it is good to once again be at Pemberley. Why, I do believe your estate improves each time we are here." She stopped cold when she noticed who stood next to him. "Eliza Bennet, what are you doing here?" With the tip of her head, Elizabeth replied, "Like you, I am a guest of the Darcy family." "Well, I never—" Miss Bingley glanced toward her sister for support. Mrs. Hurst and her husband wisely ignored her. Bingley fairly bounced into the drawing-room. "Miss Elizabeth, what a delight to see you. How is your family? Are they travelling with you?" He finally surveyed the room. His disappointment at not seeing Miss Jane Bennet was visible. Darcy welcomed them, and then introduced the Bingleys to the gardeners. Mrs. Gardiner slightly dipped her knee to them. "My husband and I have already been introduced to the ladies, when my eldest niece and I called on them at Mr. Hurst's residence in London. They returned the call not 2 months ago. It is a pleasure to meet you at last, Mr. Bingley, and Mr. Hurst." Darcy wanted to laugh. Her words were a direct blow, an arrow to the heart of the matter. Bingley would now know that Jane Bennet had been in London, and that his sisters hid that information from him. As it was, tension stiffened Bingley's spine. A reddish hue filled his countenance, from the top of his cravat to his hairline. Spinning on his heel, he hovered over his sister. "You did not tell me that Miss Bennet was in London?" Miss Bingley waved away his outburst. "Charles, now is not the time to discuss this. Why, Caroline, I believe you are in error. You see, there is not one person in this room who does not have a vested interest in your reply." She spluttered, "Charles, you are embarrassing me. If that is the case, then perhaps it is because your conduct is in question, not my manners." "Charles," she hissed, "not now." "When?" Bingley studied his sister's face before turning away from her to approach Darcy. "I apologise sincerely for our early arrival, my friend. I see that you are already fully occupied. Since we spent the night at Bakewell, and have not travelled any distance today, I believe the wisest course would be for us to depart. If you would call for my coachman to remain with my carriage, we shall leave for Netherfield Park immediately. If there is a chance for Miss Jane Bennet and me, I will know within 2 days." Turning his attention to Mr. Gardiner, Bingley said, "Pray, know that I would never approach Miss Bennet if it would cause her distress. Do you think I have reason to hope?" Mr. Gardiner replied, "I will only say that if I were in your Hessians, I would be on the road to Hertfordshire as soon as my horses were ready to travel." Bingley nodded. "Then we are off." Tipping his head, Darcy asked the footman to stop the driver from unhitching Bingley's vehicle. Miss Bingley tried to stop him. "But, Mr. Darcy, I am quite tired. I need to rest, and Pemberley is the perfect respite." Her expression sly, she simpered, "Surely you can see that returning to Hertfordshire would not be in Charles's best interest. You are aware of the danger." Darcy refused to play her game. He was grateful he had explained his interference with Bingley and Miss Bennet to Elizabeth when they were in Kent. At least, he thought that he had. Had he?
"Miss Bingley, it does not serve you well to not listen to your brother, since he is the authority figure in your home."
She batted her lashes, then cloaked herself with what she assumed was a demure expression. "Oh, Mr. Darcy, you are a tease. My brother, as you well know, will listen to your opinion over mine. He will always do what you ask. On his own he rules nothing or no one. As it is, his purpose when we departed Bakewell this morning was to journey no farther than your estate. Why he is vacillating now, I do not know. Perhaps if you were to remind him of his responsibility toward me, then we can enjoy ourselves during our stay here." Elizabeth gasped and tightened her fingers on his arm. Deciding that he had had enough, Darcy said,
"Miss Bingley, I learned a valuable lesson during the winter that will forever keep me from interfering in my friend's business again. Perhaps you should learn the same."
"Mr. Darcy," she purred, "do you not yet realise that I will become whatever you desire me to be, sir? If you want me to listen more to Charles, then consider it done." She coyly stepped closer, the feathers of her bonnet almost brushing his nose. With the stone fireplace behind him, and Elizabeth at his side, he could not step back. He loathed feeling boxed in.
"Miss Bingley, what you choose to do has nothing to do with me. I have selected the woman who will become the next mistress of Pemberley. The position is no longer available."
Caroline Bingley's nose wrinkled, like she smelled something unsavoury. "You would attach yourself to Eliza Bennet?"
"Gladly."
"Well, I never—" Spinning on her heels, she said, "I can see that we are not welcome here. Charles, let us leave." Saluting Darcy, he grinned. "Well done, my friend. May the two of you be as happy as I hope one day to be." Within a minute they were gone, leaving the drawing-room in stunned silence. His heart pounded. What had he done by announcing to the others his intention to marry Elizabeth, before he could ask her for permission? He feared looking at her. When she spoke, he braced himself. In the wise words of Miss Bingley, I can only say, well, I never. Oh, but Elizabeth Bennet was impudent. She delighted him in every way.
Do you mind, Elizabeth?
Running one hand up his arm to rest below his shoulder, her smile was radiant. Do I mind going from accepting a courtship to agreeing to marriage in less than 5 minutes? Why ever would you think I would be unsettled at the prospect? Do you not know me at all? His sister giggled, slapping her palm over her mouth. Even Mrs. Gardiner chuckled.
You are correct, my dear lady. What on earth was I thinking?
For the first time in as long as he could remember, despite his injuries and everything that happened to them since he first met Elizabeth, he was happy. Chapter 11. Elizabeth reached for Fitzwilliam's hand under the dining table. Entwining their fingers, she leaned toward him. Your sister is lovely, and your cousin is an interesting man. His look of pleasure with her observation rendered him even more handsome than usual.
Both of those comments are true. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner will always be welcome to join us here or in town, he replied.
Thank you very much. As you are aware, they mean the world to me. The Colonel abruptly cleared his throat, capturing everyone's attention.
Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, Georgiana, you might be under the impression that Darcy's affections were recently engaged. However, I tell you that this is not the case.
Richard, Darcy warned, although his cheerful expression countered his words.
I was unaware of what happened in Hertfordshire until after his accident in Kent. During his fevered days and nights, he spoke of Miss Elizabeth often. In his dreams he called for her. Through his darkest days, when we feared for his life, she was the beacon that kept him alive. Therefore I honour you, Elizabeth Bennet, soon to be Mrs. Darcy. I am proud that soon you shall be my cousin by marriage, and my partner in crime, to torment and tease Darcy for evermore.
Accepted, Colonel. Georgiana spoke next. Welcome to the family, Miss Bennet. This time, Darcy addressed the group.
Thank you, Georgiana. And, Richard, you should fear the secrets I could share. That is all I will say to you right now.
Elizabeth enjoyed seeing the two men together. Neither acted superior to the other. Instead, their relationship was built on familial love and respect.
However, you have the cart before the horse, because I have yet to propose to Elizabeth. This means that she has not yet responded. And because the process needs to be done in private, I will not officially ask to marry her in my dining room. Instead, I will choose the time and the place. What I would accept are some recommendations, if you please.
A moment of silence was broken when everyone began speaking at once.
Her uncle said, I almost died from a heart attack trying to reach the top of Mam Tor and Kinder Scout. Please do not make me try again. Possibly somewhere close would be in order.
Aunt Gardiner agreed. And neither should you descend into Poole's Cavern. Feeling closed in between the stalactites, I could not breathe. Lizzie was enamoured of the gardens at Matlock and Chatsworth. We saw a lovely area next to the house as we were arriving that is particularly beautiful.
Darcy's cousin volunteered his opinion. If you ask me, the most romantic place you could propose is in Pemberley's kitchen. You could have cook set out a row of fruit tarts between you, then offer to share them for the rest of your life.
He patted his stomach.
I would marry a woman who appreciated a good pastry.
After the laughter quieted, Miss Darcy said, I would hope that the man I fell in love with would propose to me by the fountain in the centre of the rose garden. Mamma designed the planting, and Papa liked to take me there during the summer months. He would sit on the bench with me and tell me about their courtship and the early years of their marriage. I always think of love when I picture the garden in my mind, especially when I am not at Pemberley.
I did not know this, Poppet. I'm very glad that you shared this with us. I will not only remember Mother and Father at the fountain, but I will also think of you.
Miss Darcy blushed. The warmth of Darcy's gaze when he looked at his sister lit Elizabeth's heart. When he turned his eyes on her, his heat melted any reservations she had left over from their early acquaintance. He burned for her, as she did for him. The hour was late, Pemberley was finally quiet. Darcy sipped the cognac he brought from London. Stretching out his leg, he rubbed at the flesh around his knee. He should not have volunteered to give Elizabeth and the gardeners a private tour of the family areas of the house. He was suffering for his lack of modesty. Mrs. Reynolds was ready to take his place, but he wanted to show Elizabeth the best that Pemberley had to offer. What a day it had been! Despite the sunlight breaking over a glorious Derbyshire summer morning, Darcy's attitude was dismal. Then a miracle happened. Elizabeth arrived, bringing with her happiness and joy. Rubbing his hand over his mouth, he worried that events moved too quickly throughout the day and that she was overwhelmed. He loved her with his whole heart. Could she possibly love him in return? Or could she be fearful of asking him to wait, to court her properly, instead of being rushed by the pressure of his family and hers to accept him prematurely? "Fitzwilliam?" Elizabeth walked confidently into the room. "Why are you not sleeping?"
"I could ask the same of you."
"You could, of course." He struggled to stand. "No, stay, please. I shall sit next to you if you do not mind." He continued to rise, using one of his canes and the arm of the chair.
"I do mind. If I sit for too long, my leg gets stiff and too painful to move. If I am to stroll in the rose garden like Georgiana suggested, then I need strength and flexibility to be mobile."
When she stood in front of him, he placed one hand on her shoulder. Resting the cane against the chair, he put his free hand on the other side.
"My cousin interrupted us earlier."
He did. She looked up at him expectantly. "You asked me if during all the months since Kent, ever I thought of you. As you know, yes, I did, constantly." He gently brushed the side of her neck with his thumb.
"Do you have anything you would like to ask of me?"
"I do. I was wondering how Mrs. Reynolds knew about me, and why she was in a hurry to bring me to you." He eased. This was a question he had no difficulty answering.
"As Richard mentioned during dinner, I dreamt of you. If you could imagine my Aunt Catherine's reaction when she heard me repeat your name while recovering at Rosings, then you would know why you heard nothing of my illness. You see, she feared that my attachment to you would prevent me from offering marriage to my cousin Anne. Therefore she paid out large sums to guarantee that no one, not even her ridiculous clergyman who was married to your friend, Mrs. Collins, would know the true state of my affairs. During the second week of my fever, she coerced her quack of a doctor to give me too much laudanum, enough to render me insensible. Richard happened to overhear her plans to bring in an unethical clergyman to marry me to her daughter while unconscious. Before an hour passed, he had carried me to my coach so we could leave for London. I owe Richard everything."
"As do I."
By the time we arrived at Darcy House, my fever worsened. My housekeeper there, Mrs. Davis, wisely removed the servants from the family wing so that no one heard me pleading for you. Unbeknownst to me, she wrote to Mrs. Reynolds, asking what could be done to find this Elizabeth. Since your given name is not particularly uncommon, Pemberley's housekeeper had no idea to whom I referred. It was not until later that Mrs. Davis asked Richard. From then on, they were both on the lookout for one Elizabeth Bennet. Mrs. Reynolds probably hired an express rider to send a note to Mrs. Davis that you finally had been found.
"I am deeply saddened that you suffered so much, Fitzwilliam. At the same time, it is a lovely tale that I shall never forget."
"Elizabeth, I apologise for the scene with Miss Bingley today. My error was ignoring her complaints against you in Hertfordshire. As a gentleman, I should have spoken up for you. Bingley did, you know."
Her shoulders tensed. "Why did you refrain, if I might ask?" He sighed.
"The truth is that I already felt the danger of you. Had I suddenly started defending you, she would have known. I did slip, and confess that I thought you had fine eyes and a beautiful face. The teasing after was relentless."
"I see. So you like my eyes?" Her lashes fluttered.
"I think I pretty much like everything about you, my dear lady."
The rosy hue of her cheeks served to brighten his favourite features. "I thank you, sir." Rubbing her hand up and down his forearm, she asked, "To be fair, do you have any questions for me?"
I do.
He took a moment to formulate his words.
Do you think you could love a man who may never be able to dance, or ride, or climb Mam Tor or Kinder Scout?
I do. Her hands moved in the other direction until they were atop his shoulders. When her fingers brushed the back of his neck, he feared his knees would no longer hold him.
Do you love me now?
Yes, I do, most assuredly. Tipping her head to the side, she asked without hesitating, Do you?
Unequivocally, yes. My darling, I cannot fix on the hour, or the spot, or the look, or the words. Whether it was at Netherfield Park or Rosings, I do not know. It has been far too long since I knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I would have no other as my wife. I love you.
Every ounce of affection was poured into their kiss. She made him feel alive, capable of amazing feats. She warmed him and soothed him from his head to his toes. When the need to breathe separated them, he said,
Although you already own my heart, I will not offer you my hand tonight, Elizabeth. The hour is late, and my drawing-room is not the setting I want you to remember when we are old and grey. Thus, be prepared for tomorrow, my lady.
She sighed against his lips. I will. Stepping back, her arms fell to her side. Good night, Fitzwilliam. The hardest thing he had ever done was to let her go.
Rest well, my love.
Elizabeth unfolded the note that Mrs. Reynolds delivered early in the morning.
My darling, meet me in the rose garden by the fountain. F.D.
Hurrying to ready herself, Elizabeth could not believe how broad her grin was when she glanced in the mirror. She looked ridiculous. The housekeeper guided her through narrow passageways until they reached a door. The path to the rose garden is just beyond. When you get to the border, face the sun and walk until you see the master. He will be waiting for you. Trying to slow her steps was impossible. Within minutes, she saw him standing in front of a statue of Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. The pain on his face vanished at the sight of her. No matter what happened on this day, Elizabeth needed to remember that putting weight on his leg was misery to him.
Come with me.
Extending his hand, she eagerly joined her palm to his. His steps were slow. She was awed that he had walked so far for her. They were almost to the far border when he stopped. There, the ground had been freshly turned. On the edge of the garden was a basket filled with cut blooms. The fragrance wafted up to her. The roses were glorious. Next to the basket was a lone plant with wispy roots at the bottom.
This shall be our rose, Elizabeth, our portion of Pemberley that belongs solely to us. We will nurture our love here, so that it grows stronger and heartier than the tall oaks in the forest.
He was so sweet, and so handsome, and manly, and romantic. What is the rose called?
I did not think to ask, but what he told me was that this particular flower has thrived in Derbyshire for centuries. This will be our future, Elizabeth, our heritage rose.
Carefully leaning down, he pulled a bud from the basket. Standing erect to hand it to her, he moved far too quickly. First he swayed, then his arms flailed. Grabbing him around the middle, she threw her weight back, throwing them both off balance. They landed hard on the soft earth.
Elizabeth, are you...
She laughed from her position under him, his weight uncomfortable, but not unpleasant. My dear man, will we ever be able to remain on our feet when we are around each other, or will we continue to fall? Poking his elbows into the dirt, he framed her face with both large hands.
I have fallen for you, Elizabeth. I love you dearly. Marry me, Elizabeth.
Never could she have imagined a more romantic proposal. There was only one answer. Since I truly fell for you those many months ago, I can only say, yes, I would love to marry you. Epilogue. August 1814, Pemberley. Alexander George Fitzwilliam Darcy wobbled on unsteady feet. his dark hair mussed, his arms outstretched. Darcy adored his son's silly grin. Alex bounced up and down instead of stepping forward. "Come to Mamma." Elizabeth sat about 6 feet away. Reaching toward the boy, she encouraged him with his favourite toy, a shiny silver rattle that the lad liked to toss to the floor, since the noise hitting the marble tiles was louder than when he shook it in his tiny fist. "Walk to Mamma." Alex giggled as he continued bouncing. Darcy finally lifted him off the floor, his chubby legs continuing to pump up and down, then set him back so his feet touched the marble.
"Walk to your mamma, son."
Hesitating, Alex leaned forward, putting his weight on his right leg. Tapping his left foot on the tiles, he finally shifted his weight to that foot. As soon as Darcy released his grip on Alex, he sat down. At 5 months, the lad pulled himself forward with his elbows, dragging his feet behind him. At 6 months, he would rock forward and backward on his hands and knees. At 7 months, he took off crawling and did not stop. Because of his son's speed when crossing the floor, Darcy appreciated how much his bad leg healed. Had Elizabeth not insisted that he exercise regularly, he could never have kept up with Alex. At 11 months, Alex pulled himself up to a standing position. 2 days prior, he started walking around pieces of furniture. That morning, Alex let go of the chair, finally standing on his own. He was so proud of himself until he realised his father let go, whereupon he dropped to his knees, hurrying toward his mamma. Scooping him up into his arms, Darcy blew on his son's neck, generating a full laugh from his son and his wife. Darcy's life was full of joy. A month after their marriage, Georgiana permanently moved to Pemberley. She postponed her debut until Elizabeth was safely delivered of their child. With Bingley and his wife living close, Darcy's sister bloomed under the kindness of Elizabeth and Jane. Darcy blossomed too. Gone were the weeds of prideful arrogance. Instead, the relationship with his wife nurtured patience, gentleness, and loving attention. Leaning over, Darcy kissed his bride of 2 years.
"Shall we try again?"
Elizabeth's fingers stroked Alex's cheek as Darcy's hand slid over her extended waistline. "Fitzwilliam, I am delighted that he is ready to move about freely. We cannot keep him a baby forever. But what if he falls and hurts himself?" Wrapping her in his arms, their son wiggled to get down. Darcy set him on the floor where he could hold onto the sofa.
"You fell in Hertfordshire. I fell in Kent. It was here in Derbyshire that I finally understood how much we needed each other to be happy. Other than taking too long for me to realise how much I need and want you, I have no regrets, my heart. Do you?"
"Never." Elizabeth hugged him tightly. We needed the time and distance to comprehend each other's value and to allow our love to grow and mature. His life was complete.
"Then we teach Alex and our unborn child that when circumstances arise that turn their lives upside down, they need only to fall slowly, my love."
The end. This has been Falling Slowly, a Pride and Prejudice novella, written by Christy Capps, narrated by Stevie Zimmerman. Copyright 2024 by Joy D. King. Production copyright by Joy D. King.